Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spill jams and spill tea. I don't know why I said any of that shit like I did, but that'll set the tone for the mood today. If you noticed, we're a few members short today, not because we're doing an episode or an impromptu recording, but because we are the two Opeth experts. You have listened to any singular episode of this podcast in the past before, you undoubtedly know that pretty much every member of our little conglomerate is a big fan of Opeth. You know, it's not like you could tell by the t-shirt that I'm wearing or anything. But we've covered albums
Yeah,
like
me either.
my favorite album by Opeth is Kentucky. And we actually have covered an Opeth album in the past. We've covered the classic seminal release of Blackwater Park. We were all pretty over the moon about that one. But we've kind of been itching to talk about this band in a greater context. And, since we've already covered one of the albums, it's a little bit difficult to keep recommending them like we do something like Porcupine Tree. Opeth has a really big catalog. And because generally speaking, we want to tackle this say Zach and Tyler tackled the Animal Collective episode, where you have two people who were really, really seasoned and experienced with the band's music, going after it from the perspective of fans who know everything about it. So this is a little bit different from your average B-sides or whatever that like we used to do. This is more of a incisive two super fans do a retrospective on the career of Opeth. Morgan and I are the two people who sort of introduced this band to everybody else. You can sort of see Tyler in the early days of the podcast get into the band. But just in the whole greater speaking, Morgan, you are the 0.0 for the Opeth fandom of all of us, because you were the one who introduced me to them. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Opeth and what this whole band is all about in a very broad sense?
Opeth, Swedish death metal band, progressive death metal band, just progressive band now, broadly. Very well known within metal circles, probably as popular as a band like Mastodon, just as well acclaimed. But yeah, these guys are, and mainly, it's difficult to say these guys because the lineup at any given moment is
We'll get into
but
member changes once we go through the discography. Just you wait.
but the figurehead at the center of it all, at least when when the band actually started recording albums, because he was not a founding member of this band.
Nope.
Funnily enough, is Michael Ackerfeld, vocal god.
Yeah. Let's
Yeah.
just, without further ado, get right into it. As Morgan kind of alluded to, Opeth technically formed in 1989 in Stockholm, Sweden, by former Eruption keyboardist Michael Ackerfeld and the real technical founding member of the band, David Isberg. Opeth, just fun fact, comes from the Swedish word opet, which is the name of a fictional city in the novel The Sunbird, which translates roughly to the city of the moon. So just in case you were curious where that comes from. Initially, Isberg invited Ackerfeld to join the current musical project he was forming, which didn't have a name formally or anything, as a bassist. Ackerfeld showed up to practice one day, and it became clear that Isberg did not inform his current bassist that Ackerfeld was going to replace him. An argument then ensued, and Ackerfeld and Isberg parted ways to form their own project. So I guess technically we have a weird misunderstanding to thank for this entire project's formation. Cool.
Such is life.
And the drama, unfortunately, doesn't even end there, because if you know anything about the band, you'll know that their debut album was made and released in 1995. So that's a 6-year gap from when they technically formed. So basically what happened is Isberg and Ackerfeld recruited drummer Anders Norden. I'm going to butcher all of these names, and I'm very sorry. bassist Mick Doring, and guitarist Andreas DeMeo for their initial lineup. Doring and DeMeo were supposedly unsatisfied with the band's slow progress and left after the first performance. They were subsequently replaced with guitarist Kim Peterson and bassist Johan de Farfalla. De Farfalla then left to spend time with his girlfriend and was going to be replaced by Matthias Ander, but then was actually replaced by Ackerfeldt's longtime friend Peter Lindgren. Peterson then left the band after the second performance, and Lindgren switched to guitar. The role of bassist now went to Stefan Gutklint. And the following year, David Isberg left the band, citing creative differences, leaving Mikhail as the sole founding member, and he took over the role of the vocals, then forming what we know as the first official Opeth lineup. The earliest and most distinct part of Opeth's sounds were that the band were less interested in incorporating the more traditional and more fundamental aspect of blast beats into their sound and focused instead on the incorporation of acoustic guitars and guitar harmonies at the core sound of the band. And in 1995, Opeth recorded their debut album, Orchid, which is the first album we're talking about here, with the help of producer and musician Dan Swano, lead vocalist for progressive metal band Edge of Sanity. Because of distribution issues with the newly formed Candlelight Records, which they were signed to, the album didn't properly release until 1995, and initially it was released only in Europe. It was immediately noted for its distinct sound, incorporating God fucking damn it, I can't talk.
Incorporating acoustic guitars.
Thank you. Incorporating acoustic guitars, piano, and clean vocals, which brings us, of course, to Orchid. And honestly, like, one of the reasons that it's good that Morgan and I are covering this band is that not only are we huge fans of the band's catalog and just general sort of, I guess, pseudo experts on what this shit is all about, since we never fucking stop listening to their music, is that we have a pretty uniform opinion of their albums. I don't really think there's any like real stark disagreements that we have on basically any of these, but I know that just in a general sense, you're definitely a little bit more fond and feverish of this album than I am. So tell me, what exactly is it about the Opeth debut that you find novel, interesting, or just like coming back to an album like this as opposed to something like the standouts of Blackwater Park or Still Life? What is it about this album that leaps out to you immediately?
You can immediately hear that these were musicians who had been practicing this particular craft for 6 years up to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Performance-wise, this really can't be faulted. It's just an immensely talented group of people coming together to make death metal Iron Maiden, and it gets a lot of novelty out of that. It gets a lot of mileage out of that idea. When you consider just how refined this is for a debut album from a band like this, and how much it stood out from other Swedish contemporaries of that time, Opeth immediately sounded like they had their own distinct voice, and that would continue to evolve over the years. So it's always exciting to see where that started. It reminds me a fair bit of Metallica's Kill 'Em All in that sense. I don't think it's as good as that album, but for a first go around, they pretty much, like, here they're already doing stuff that I could, as a musician in a similar realm, would never even begin to think about. So that goes a long way with me personally.
Yeah, I understand that. Like, I personally think the album is like bookended like fucking spectacularly. In the Mist She Was Standing, the opening track, and The Apostle in Triumph are just like basically as good as like songs as this band would ever make, frankly. Like, and they're like monolithic too. I mean, 14 minutes and 13 minutes respectively. And then there's never a moment where they really like lose me or something about the sound doesn't really work. Yeah, the experience of this band, like, you know, maybe they didn't like get to their technical lineup for 6 years, but like these musicians were clearly people who were not totally inexperienced. I think the interesting thing about revisiting this album for me was noticing that like maybe it's just that my ears are a little bit more trained to this sound and metal in general. But the production was definitely a lot less rough than I remember it being. Like it sounds a lot rougher than anything they would do after Morningrise, I think. But it definitely has a sort of appeal in being like the start point of Opeth, in that like if you were getting into this band or if you're getting into heavy music in general, Opeth is a great band to start with. And there are positives and negatives to starting here with the band, in that you sort of get a really good blueprint for what they're doing. You know, immediately off the bat, it's not exactly friendly to somebody who's unfamiliar with metal or unfamiliar with progressive music. So that might be a little bit of a stumbling block for you. It's not quite as accessible, but it really lets you chart the trajectory a whole lot better. Sort of learning to understand and enjoy albums like this is a bit of a process. And personally, I think that my enjoyment for it has increased a little bit over the years, mainly because I got to see the stark differences, you know, that Morgan sort of pointed out with, in that this is so different from the contemporary death metal scene, and that sort of, you know, the beginning of the 90s was the start of the death metal movement. And we've actually covered sort of the ground zero for that. We've done a B-sides on the band Death, another one of our favorite metal bands. And their sound sort of like, as they start as like, you know, nascent death metal to progressive death metal around this time period, still, even though they were making progressive music at this point, still sounds so different than that. Like their sound is a lot more elemental. This is a lot more ornate. It's a little bit more thoughtful, and the roughness doesn't always work for me personally, but like, and structurally speaking, again, I said the bookends were great, and nothing here is bad. But the sort of the more brief moments on the album strike me as a little bit more inessential. Stuff like Silhouette or Requiem are just sort of, you know, 3 minute, 1 minute long interludes between the huge 10-minute set pieces, and sometimes like the shortest proper song on here is just under 10 minutes. And you can kind of feel the unrefinedness. Like some of them, there's a little bit too much homogeneity here. But even though that said, I still feel like that's really more a matter of opinion and taste than like pure evaluation. You could come down on viewing this album as an enjoyable novelty like me, or you could really get into the fact that this is a distinctly different flavor of what Opeth are typically known as. But this is very much an album that I think was made because of the fact that like they needed material to work with. Like they didn't really tour with this album that much. This was sort of like to get the launching off point from.
Yeah, the album's structure is certainly a sort of sticking point. There are those moments where part of it just feels completely inessential, but it also feels like if you removed them and you're just going from 10-minute song to 13-minute song to 14-minute song, completely back to back like that, like the album threatens to come apart at the seams, just because there would be so much consecutively. So it leaves it in this really weird place of not really being cohesive and being way too cohesive.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree. It's definitely like a strange middle ground that it is, because like I agree, the album is both better and worse for breaking up these moments. And like it's not like these movements and these longer songs don't have variation in and of themselves. They're still very much progressive music, but still the band still clearly are they're not quite as dynamic as they're going to become, as they're going to evolve into. But it's still easy to see why, like, this album has like a 3.5 on Rate Your Music, which is generally like a really, really good score. It's easy to see why this is an album that like most Opeth fans still look at very, very fondly, even if I'm not like in fucking love with it. And maybe I could appreciate the relative simplicity a little bit more in with time. Stuff like that. You never know. There's also, for the record, there's like tons of different versions of these first three albums, whether or not you're listening to different remasters or different compilations in them. Some of them have added the eighth track, the sort of unofficial eighth track, Into the Frost of Winter, which is a live recording, I believe. And the song itself is cool. The recording is unlistenable.
Yeah, it's not like that's the version that is available on pretty much all streaming platforms. And when I first downloaded the album, I wasn't on any streaming platforms at the time, so I was going through and like YouTube to MP3ing Life of a Teenager.
Been there.
With no money. So when I did that, I downloaded that song because I thought everything told me that it was like an official part of the album.
Yeah.
And then I got to the end of the album and that song came on and I was like, something is wrong here. Like,
that was the first song from this album I ever heard too, just because I liked the title. So I played it and was like,
it's not a reliable metric for the sound of the album.
No, I wish they were a little bit better about labeling this kind of thing. And
yeah,
kind of unfortunately, at least in my opinion, they have future live releases proper that aren't like tacked on to the end of albums. They do sometimes, but like a lot of Opeth live recordings are, in my opinion, even when the quality is just like notably better and not being recorded with a fucking like the ass of a dumpster, like they're just they're just parts where like you don't get like, I don't want to undersell the fact that Opeth are like, they're obviously a fantastic live act. You can find countless videos of them doing incredible work, as good as anything on any of their albums. So this isn't like a uniform thing, but a lot of the live albums to me fail to capture like what is so great about the studio synergy that they've had basically since the first album. That even if the recording is rougher, the way the balance of the instruments just, it isn't always on like it is on the studio recordings always. So I'm not gonna like super focus on those live recordings or anything, but some are worth listening to if you're like just ravenously consuming this band as I am.
The fact of the matter is that Into the Frost of Winter sounds like a demo, and all of this would be a complete non-issue if they just, in parentheses on streaming platforms and CDs and stuff, just demo. Because it's a particularly poor demo as well.
Yeah, like it just,
I feel like I can't really comment on the quality of the song because I have no idea what it sounds like.
So yeah, Orchid it's a promising start to Opeth's career. It's an obviously accomplished record, but real interesting is, where do we go from here? And that, of course, is just in the following year, 1996. Opeth returned to the studio the year after, and they played some live shows with Orchid just to sort of, test out what everything was like. And with the help of Dan Swano again, they released Morningrise in June of 1996. They toured in support of this album in a Scandinavian tour alongside Cradle of Filth. And while on tour, they attracted the attention of Century Media Records, who signed the band and released the first two albums in the US in 1997. So this was sort of the album that really put them on the map as not only a Scandinavian act, but as one that had sort of more, farther reaching appeal, just because, death metal, it's a little bit more popular now. It has an audience, so other countries come in and sign these bands. It's so weird to look at this shit before the age of streaming, where this was like an issue of just like, it wasn't a simultaneous release on the Spotify, blah. But like,
It's like, yeah, I mean, now you're just like, put the shit up on Bandcamp. Nobody fucking just do it.
Yeah, it's like fucking Mikhail, stop being so fucking lazy and but fucking start a YouTube channel, post it on Reddit. What are you doing?
What's going on here?
What are you
SoundCloud,
doing?
Opeth.
And Morningrise, the album in question here, is a notable step up, I think, in recording and composition, in lots of ways. It definitely sees Opeth refining their sound and becoming a little bit closer to what everyone knows as what Opeth is. There's a little bit more of the dark folk instrumental elements here that are a little bit more pronounced. And notably, this album has like a 3.78 on Rate Your Music. It's distinctly like it's a very highly rated album, the first bolded record that they have. And like we said before with Orchid, is that it would be a little weird if its instrumental interludes and briefer moments sort of weren't there, that it would ultimately harm the album's pacing, even though it also kind of hurts the album's pacing. And Morningrise is sort of counter to that, in that it does not have the interludes and brief moments between songs, and in fact is just longer songs. Notably, there is not a song that is shorter than 10 minutes on this album. 5 tracks. It is 66 minutes long. And this, of course, features the longest Opeth song to date, even now, in the form of Black Rose Immortal, which is a towering 20 minutes and 14 seconds long. So this is a big fucking deal. This is an album that's sort of considered to be like the first properly great Opeth album, and have some of their like most standout tracks that'll like appear on top tens of people's and whatnot. And it's definitely easy to see why. I do think, like, as a whole, I prefer Morningrise to Orchid. That said, if I have anything as close to a controversial take on this video, it's that I really don't think it's that much better than Orchid. And in many ways, I kind of think it's basically as good, even though the recording's a little bit better, everything's a little bit more refined. But it comes down to that pacing. It might hurt, like, it's really just up to you as to whether or not, do you prefer early Opeth when they're a little bit more fundamentals, and exercising their muscular prowess that's just hit like it is here, or on Orchid where they're testing the waters a little bit more, and it's maybe a little bit less, like, it's more loose, it's a little bit more broken up here, but mileage may vary. I prefer this one, but even on stuff like Black Rose Immortal, I like every song here. I think every song here is good. Great, even to some extent. But that said, I kind of think that Black Rose Immortal is a song that, like, it is great. It's probably in my top 3 on the album, but it also is like,
well, there's 5 songs on the album.
yeah, well, there's 5 songs on the album, and it's a little too long.
It's just it's really quite overrated in the Opeth fan base. I hate to say it, but I feel like
Morgan, you have a more pronounced opinion of this album than I do, so I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, yeah, I agree in the sense that I prefer Morningrise by just a little bit. It feels like it has a bit more focus than Orchid, and really gets a lot out of that. I also feel like the album in general, in both sound and tone, is much gnarlier and darker and more. It almost leans more towards the black metal's influence of this band's sound in comparison to Orchid.
Especially shit like The Night and Silent Water, definitely.
Yeah. And it gets a lot out of that. But it also, like, because of that, and because of the fact that it is 10-minute song after 10-minute song after 20-minute song, it is frankly just an exhausting listen, even if it is a quite rewarding one. So, and I think that's ultimately where my opinion on it sort of comes down, is that Orchid is a lot more fun to listen to, but Morningrise is a lot more rewarding.
Yeah.
So it really they just end up kind of leveling out on my ranking with Morningrise just sort of taking the edge because of the fact that it is more sort of leaning into the black metal side of their sound in a way that they never really did after this.
Hmm.
And I get again, there is novelty in that as well as someone who didn't start here. Yeah, I still think it's a really stellar album.
Yeah.
Um, one of the best death metal albums of its time, really. Just really strong stuff. Every aspect of performance is refined here even more, and it ends with what I believe is their best song to up to this point, which is "To Bid You Farewell," which is just one of their best songs overall. Still, I would say.
Yeah, I broadly very much agree with that. I have to personally say I think my favorite song on the album is Nectar, which like
Yeah.
it like that sort of like center, like I know it's not technically the centerpiece, but it is like the middle track here, which it really feels like those first two songs really build to that, and it makes the satisfying nature that's like immediately like, or at least the most immediate track on there for my money anyway, it makes it like pay off a little bit more. We see a little bit more deliberate structuring on this album, even if the sort of unkemptness of the song's length kind of even out any structural advantages the album really has, in my opinion. But to speak on the one thing, one aspect of the band that I guess we haven't really touched on here is like lyrical content, which I know, death metal in general, lyrics aren't always what you go to for this, but I must say, um, two things about this band in general, in specific regards to Michael as a front man, as a vocalist, as a writer, are that he is amazing at showcasing duality. The cool thing with Opeth is that he has the beautiful, melodious, clean vocals, and he has the demonic, harsh growling, and both of them are kind of at like they're great off the bat. Like on Orchid, they're great. On Here, they're great. Um, and sort of learning how they sort of balance that kind of gentleness with the really muscular death metal shit is really awesome. Like from the outset, it's one of the band's like most dynamic and interesting components. That sort of acoustic incorporation is something that's really, really interesting. At least that like separates them from acts that were, their contemporaries at the time. And as like a lyricist and even as a storyteller, I think generally speaking, I think fans definitely give him his due just because I read a lot about this. I'm pretty active on the Opeth subreddit, as I'll mention later. But Michael as a lyricist and a storyteller, I think is really, really undervalued. Just from like a prose standpoint, everything he talks about is gothic, tragic. It's draped in ornamental words and poetic. Like, I mean, it's it's like borderline emo at times. Like especially on these like really early albums, notably on the next one too. Um, but the really awesome thing about him is that from like, the outset, he's a really cool storyteller, is that he's really great at painting these portraits of tragic figures. There is a obsession this band has with like displaying a sort of internal rot, sort of like love being something that becomes the ultimate downfall of characters. There's like Shakespearean tragedy levels of shit in some of these songs and some of these albums. And it's not as present on these first two records. It's really more going forward from here, but it's still something that on these albums is totally worth paying attention to. It's just not like at its sort of apex yet, where there are some albums where it's a concept record and the whole thing is a flowing narrative. And there's some albums where it's kind of like vignettes or like ghost reveries, something like that, is like individual stories of different characters and what have you. And it's really like, it's fascinating to follow. And they're like really different from one another. But here, it's not, that's an aspect of the band that isn't quite there yet, but it's still cool to pay attention to. So, if you haven't done that yet, it's worth it.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I'm in complete agreement. The peak of their catalog really includes a whole slew of concept albums, and uh, while the stories told and the lyrics therein are never necessarily the draw, Like it's never exactly what you're there for in terms of immediacy, at the very least. They tend to go really undervalued because of that. And I think they're all really well drawn. And I think To Bid You Farewell at the end of Morningrise is a really stellar sign of things to come in that sense. It's both the most quiet and contemplative song that the band had done up to that point, and lyrically evokes so much of the ideas that would be explored on the next two albums.
Yeah, and I think that perfectly segues us into going forward here, where there's a little bit of a disparity between these next, the two albums that we just covered in the third one. So in 1997, after they toured Morningrise, Ackerfeld and Lindgren dismissed De Farfalla for personal reasons without the consent of Norden. When Ackerfeld informed Norden, who was on vacation in Brazil at the time, Norden also left the band and remained in Brazil for personal reasons. Former Eternal members, drummer Martin Lopez, formerly of Amon Amarth, and I think just generally speaking, Martin Lopez, one of the most beloved contributors to this band. I mean, literally like top 5 metal drummers of all time. Personally, he when Amon Amarth is a band where that is your less substantial contribution to the metal world, that's something else. And alongside the other Martin, bassist Martin Mendez, who also the GOAT, they both of them responded to an ad in a music shop that had been placed by Michael Ackerfeld. Lopez and Mendez were both fans of the band, and they took the ads down themselves so no other musicians could apply for the job. Ackerfeld and Lindgren did not want the Martins to join at first due to them already knowing each other. They felt that they wanted two strangers so that there wouldn't be two camps in the band, but they eventually did hire both. Lopez made his debut with Opeth playing a cover version of Iron Maiden's Remember Tomorrow, which was included on the album A Call to Iron's A Tribute to Iron Maiden, the compilation. So that happened. Then, once they got picked up by Century Media, they had a larger recording budget, and Opeth began to work on their third album, My Arms, Your Hearse, with noted Swedish producer Fredrik Nordstrom at Studio Fredman in August of 1997. Although Opeth had Mendez, due to time constraints, Ackerfeld actually played bass on this album. And My Arms, Your Hearse was sort of the moment Opeth arrived, both critically, commercially, and from like a retrospective sound point. This is like the moment I think that I can say Opeth became the band everyone knows Opeth to be. And as a result, I have no dissenting opinion here. I can definitely be, I'm probably a little bit milder than most Opeth fans are on the first two records. However, the same cannot be said for My Arms, Your Hearse. At one point, this was my favorite heavy record in the band's catalog. I would sort of compare my band, like, relationship to this album and this band the way I would compare it to Death, and that Leprosy was my favorite album from that band for a while, because it was the one that I was most immediately able to understand and grasp, because it was a more fundamental part of their sound, even though it's obviously very accomplished. And My Arms, Your Hearse is definitely the Leprosy of Opeth's catalog, in that like everything kind of builds from here, but that's not to detract from the fact that everything on here is just A+, super powered, S tier charged versions of everything that came before it. Like we alluded to, there is a concept on this album which is admittedly a little bit loose from like a narrative ABC point of view. That said, I really like how it translates into the music here, and that this is the story of like a man grieving the love of his life. And the way it works here is sort of like it's exploring the inner turmoil of grief, which is something that's, the band aren't strangers to, but it's more focused and singular here. And an interesting thing about the album is that all of the song titles on this record end with the word that is the title of the next song. It gives you a little bit of an idea as to the connective tissue of everything working here. And structurally, it manages to be sort of the answer to the previous two records sort of having different versions of the same problem, whereas this album comes along and yeah, it has the briefer tracks that serve as connective tissue. Well, really just the two, Prologue and Madrigal. But these are pieces of music that, while brief, do feel as though like if they weren't here, the album would be lesser. The abrupt shifts that they sort of that sandwich between them would feel a little bit too much. So I think this is an album that too, it also has like the bigger, longer songs. They're just a little bit more fleshed out. They're a little bit shorter than even they were on Orchid. The longest song here is the Amen Corner, which is 8 minutes and 44 seconds. So this is a lot more digestible of an album than the two that preceded as well. If you're acquainted with stuff like Pink Floyd or whatever, this is not exactly what I would call a challenging listen. If I had to say what the broadest record that, like, if you're looking to get into this band or if you're looking to get into heavy music, broadly speaking, this is the album I would go to first, because it both displays the strengths and the progressiveness of this band. It has a little bit more of the core death metal sound that the first two albums display that isn't really pronounced going forward, because the band gets a little bit more progressive from here on out. Not to demean the progressiveness here, but it also gives you like a blueprint for what you like about the band and what they'll do later. Like everything from here, they'll maximize an element, or they'll focus on something here that, not so much that it's better than this album, but that it's a different facet of it. And I can easily see this, something as early as their third album being somebody's absolute favorite record. The fact that this isn't a top tier Opeth record for me is kind of astounding when I really look and think about it, but it's fucking amazing. And I'm sure you don't really have a dissenting opinion here, at least not to my knowledge.
Yeah, here's the thing. It's at this point that Opeth starts a run of albums that lasts for 10 years, 98 to 2008, and 10 years and 7 albums that are, and I like 5 of them are 10s and the other 2 are 9s. So
I believe I have the exact same rating spread.
like, hey, stupid. This is stupid. We are in the stupid era of
the sicko mode.
While My Arms, Your Hearse is more digestible and more concise and perhaps less experimental than the previous 2 albums, whatever the hell that even means in this context. It's also just a complete and utter upgrade over them in every conceivable measure, other than the inability to account for taste. This is just a better album. I said that our Morningrise segment, that To Bid You Farewell was the best song they had done up to that point, and there are at least 4 songs on here that are better than that.
Yeah.
And it's also, I also definitely agree that this is a fantastic place to start with the band, because it's the beginning of their fucking goated era, and like it also sounds very distinct from how the band's sound would progress afterwards. There's the way, I think in particular, I would point to the way that this album is produced. There is a particular shine to the more clean sections, whether that be just clean guitar tones and vocal passages and acoustic guitars. The heavy, death metal parts, I think, stand out and sort of are more vibrant as a result of that. It is worth noting, I think the album is just a bit less gnarly than Morningrise, just for the sake of comparison, but also, listen to like the first 30 seconds of When and tell me that, this is Opeth gone soft. new fucking 4 words. Demon of the Fall.
This is the part of the video where it becomes abundantly clear. It's like we're coming at this from an evaluative standpoint. We're trying to cover everything, but this is the part of the video where Morgan alluded to them being in their imperial era, where we just start soy facing the entire
I
fucking time.
I fucking hooting, hollering, howling, etc.
Demon, demon of the fall.
I mean the first portion of that song is gobsmacking, and then you get to that breakdown with the just the acoustic guitar playing the most uncomfortable, like grimy ass riff ever put to an acoustic guitar. And then Ackerfeld just like invents screaming. It's like it is a moment that is so incredible to listen to that it makes me want to cry. Like I feel like I'm Hugh Jackman at the end of the fountain, just fucking oh. But it's like impossibly hard. Every Opeth fan knows Demon of the Fall and knows that it is some of the dopest shit anyone has ever put to wax. So anything further than my bloviating on it is really just preaching to the choir. Because if you're a fan of metal and have not heard this song, you're missing a piece of the puzzle. And the thing is, that might not even be my favorite song on the album. It probably is, but like the fact that I don't know is like
what?
What? Huh?
There are at least 3 other songs on here that I think would give it a run for its money.
Yeah, I would. Credence is fantastic. When April Ethereal.
Yeah.
I mean,
I gotta stick up here and say that my favorite song on the album here is the technical fucking like the penultimate good job penultimate moment on the album, which is Karma, which is
yeah. I feel like that's a particularly somehow underrated track in terms of this album. And just, I mean, and by nature, the discography in general.
Yes.
That shit is disgusting.
I mean, even the 4-minute epilogue on this album slaps my titties. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Butters my biscuits.
I don't know how to like there's a point where you can just sort of like you just run out of superlatives, but I think the thing that you spoke to that's really evident about this album is really just the contrasts, and that like the lighter, more beautiful part of Opeth's sound is like at its most beautiful that it's ever been. And then the heavier parts of Opeth's sound, while definitely not as like pitch black as stuff on Morningrise, it's as measuredly heavy. It's heavy in a way that feels like it's designed to beat you rather than it's just like flattening you outright. And I mean, like, again, this has several fan favorite Opeth tracks. April Ethereal is one of the best kickstarts to an Opeth album that exist, and like that is not an easy claim to make.
No.
But I mean, again, when holy shit, and like I think of like the centerpiece tracks here. My least favorite song on here is probably like the Amen Corner, and that song kicks fucking ass.
Yeah. Like, it's stupid.
Like of the 8-minute tracks, it's a little a little bit lesser than the other 2 songs on the album that are that long, but like
yeah, I mean, do you want the fucking the greatest chicken parm of your life or the greatest lasagna of your life? That's
difference between an A+ and an A-. It's marginal at best. And like,
yeah,
2, it's got that narrative, which is a particularly like, it's not a strong aspect of the album, but I think the best thing about it, like, it's very much in relation to this album's album cover, which is really interesting to me just because like, I never knew what this album cover even was until I found like, I'm pretty sure it was a post on Reddit where it was just like a photograph of nature, and like they just like upped the contrast to an absurd degree to the point where it looks like what the album cover is. And like, I was never able to identify what it was, but I was just like, I don't even really think I like the album cover in particular, personally speaking. But when I look at the album cover, it's like, that's what it sounds like. The atmosphere that it's
Yeah,
created
it's
is heavy and drenched in that like really saturated blue and red.
yeah, I like it's super evocative
Mhm.
of the material on it. Um, and
And like the
I
roughness comparative too, I think.
yeah, I love it for that reason. But it's
Yeah, fair
also,
enough.
graphic design is my passion.
I mean, and it's also just because this band have some god
The
tier album
the
art.
the best.
Yeah, I mean, they literally have my favorite album cover of all time, which, well, then that segues into the album with my favorite album cover of all time, The Goat. To be a little bit more specific here, in 1999, ownership of Candlelight Records switched hands, and Opeth then signed with Peaceville Records in Europe. It's notably the first album to be recorded entirely with Mendes, even though the studio they were recording in at the time was being relocated. The band only had time to rehearse the songs they had written for this album twice before they actually ended up recording it. And Still Life was released in October of 1999, even though the US release was not until 2001. And yeah, then we got Still Life. And the reason I think it's really notable that they only rehearsed this twice basically speaks to the level of talent that they're operating at. Because if I didn't know that particular factoid, this, like, I would assume this took eons to craft. Like the compositions, the way, like the way everything fits together on this album, it is, I mean, it, not to demean My Arms Your Hearse, an album I love to the moon and back, but it makes it look like kiddie shit in comparison.
Yeah.
So the fact that they just kind of did this, they were operating at a level of synergy that like few bands are ever able to operate at. And that ends up resulting in Still Life, which, I mean, yeah, the critical arrival of this band was certainly something to behold in many respects before this. But even now, Still Life is an album. Like, if I hear Opeth mentioned, it is one of two albums, or at least by people who aren't us, it is one of two albums. It is either Blackwater Park or Still Life. Still Life, very notable because this is the highest rated Opeth album on Rate Your Music. While generally speaking, I think that most people, like, as a whole, would probably like more vote for Blackwater Park as being the quintessential or even best Opeth album. Still Life tends to be like the fans' favorite, in my opinion. And I know for a fact that for as much affinity as I have for this record and for as perfect as I think it is, this is your favorite Opeth album, is it not?
Yes, and the top 10 of all time album basically since I heard it.
And yeah, I held it up earlier, said it was my favorite album cover of all time. And when the album cover is my least favorite part of the album in question, that's doing a bit of a disservice. And the only thing I'll say before I take a step back and let you talk, because this obviously is an album that is like, means a lot to you, is that this album, of course, is sort of a, Opeth have found a new way to level up again. Is that the only, like, it's so fascinating to me how you can hear the marked improvement of artistic synergy that's on My Arms Your Hearse from the first two records, is that they managed to pull off that level of an upgrade again. Like, they managed to somehow, they invent 11, and this album is that. And they sort of double down on the concept, the story of the album, which, if I can take a quote from Michael himself, it's as explained by him. Still Life is a concept album. The main character is kind of banished from his hometown because he hasn't got the same faith as the rest of the inhabitants there. The album pretty much starts off from where he is returning after several years to, and I quote, hook up with his old babe. The big bosses of the town know that he's back, and I quote, a lot of bad things start happening. Thank you, Michael. Never change. You fucking himbo of music.
Hook up with his old babe.
What a fucking
Don't we?
legend.
Don't we all wish to do that very thing? At the end of the day,
It's at the center of all of our hearts, I think. So, Morgan,
yeah.
what the fuck is up with Still Life?
It's impossible not to sound hyperbolic and ridiculous with what I'm about to say, but just know that it's true. This is one of the single most compositionally and musically accomplished albums in the history of sound. Um,
Yes.
if you disagree, you're wrong. Go
Yes.
fly a kite. Um, I mean, I'm talking like this is for progressive metal what kind of blue is for jazz.
Yeah.
It is uh for progressive metal what like I don't know, pick your fucking favorite Beatles album and it's that, but what the Beatles did for pop. It's just like and it the fact that it starts with my favorite song from this band
Oh,
and then
God.
and then proceeds to like fire off six more songs that are in every measure just as good.
Oh,
I,
man.
what, what the fuck? What the fuck? What?
Shut up.
It's, it's like he's already dead. The more in particular is like, you know, gray matter expanding. Um,
I would describe it as life changing.
yeah, it changed the way I listen to music. And I can't really explain how or why that works. But it does.
It's that
And
opening, man. It's like it starts out as just like you just hear that distant melody of the guitar just da 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 da, and it just gets like it just slowly gets louder. It goes on for almost like 2 minutes, and then it just oh
yeah, you get the acoustic passage, which is just like at that point you're like, oh, some shit's about to go down, man. I'm scared.
oh, it's beautiful.
Um, and then it hits, and then it keeps building after it hits, and then there's like the after a while of it hitting like that, there's the clean vocal section where he's like, oh, the faces turn away. And I'm like,
Oh man, this is when like his clean vocals are always great. Don't get me wrong, but I feel like this is the first album to really properly know how to not use them, but like to produce them so that they sound like
yeah,
really harmonious with themselves, but also like there's always something a little bit discordant about the way he performs them. There's something a little bit off about these harmonies that like is just perfect and kind of unsettling. And it makes tracks like The More so much better. It's a world of difference.
I think like the harmonies, there are just more vocal tracks laid down than on previous albums, and it lends the clean vocals so much more heft and depth and just fucking God.
Boing. I mean,
And
it's just a flawlessly produced album. I mean, to not to put too
yeah,
fine a point on it is that like everything before this, I would say that like at worst is well produced. And at best, I think
mhm,
is close to perfect. But it's still everything before this is still like the sound at its best still might not be something that you fully gel with or fully love or fully get into, or maybe it's like, oh, death metal just isn't, or like this part of Opeth isn't just for me, whatever. But like this is the point where I have to throw down all of whatever credibility I have and just say, if you don't think this is perfectly produced or sounds perfect, I take your opinion a little bit less seriously on music as a whole. This is
mm,
accessible and flawless. So I don't want to hear it.
like buy better headphones.
Yeah, you're the
Get
problem.
better.
Sorry.
Get smarter.
Get good.
Like, uh, I mean, and then Godhead's Lament after that.
But
But and then Benighted after that, which is just like it's like, oh, we perfected the the dopest extreme music you ever heard on the two songs previous, and now we're going to perfect beauty itself with an
yes.
acoustic guitar and a single man's voice. And I just, yeah, fuck you, Michael. Fuck, get out. Enough.
I mean, it's and like lyrically, compositionally, it's just as impressive as anything of the death metal aspects on here. Like, and it also starts the trend going forward of like Opeth kind of has one song that's just this, and they're all
Yeah.
fantastic. And it speaks volumes to the Benighted. Benighted might be the best. I'm not sure if I would say it's the best, but it might be.
Could do. It's a fucking good. But yeah, I'll put it like this: my least favorite track and the lowest rating on this album that I have on the Rate Your Music, where you can go through and rate each individual track, is Moonlapse Vertigo, and I have that at a 9, and everything else is a 10. And the fact that Moonlapse Vertigo is my least favorite anything is like laughable because it's
Moonlapse Vertigo is like it was one of my favorite songs on here for a long time. I don't think I'd say that now, but this has parts of this is where you can feel Opeth going beyond like not just on this song, but you can feel Opeth going beyond the things that have influenced them up until this point to where like there are parts of this song and parts of this album that sound borderline psych rock infused, and Moonlapse Vertigo as a whole is just like there are just parts of this song that sound fucking alien. Like it sounds like nothing I've heard in death metal or progressive music as a whole, and it gets elaborated upon further in albums like Blackwater Park. But to just know that they just started doing wacky weird shit like this on this album, and they were just like, yeah, we're perfect at it, shut the fuck up. I don't.
Yeah, like I did allude to this a little bit before when talking about the more, but these mixes are so busy and dense, and they all sort of coagulate into things that are like it's like somebody crawled in your ear and gave your eardrum a massage. It's like
Was pre 2000, and notably this is an album that like it's not that exactly it's like his sensibilities, but like, favorite musician of the podcast, Steven Wilson, comes in to do some production work on some Opeth albums when we'll get to those. But the fact that this is an album that like isn't mixed by Steven Wilson and still like is what it is. What? What?
You get a gold medal, whoever
like it's a marvel of engineering
and engineer this.
I don't know how they did it. I straight up don't know how.
I want to go into the Pro Tools file of this and just see like 30 fucking just reams of tracks.
And the fact that it doesn't sound like overproduced, overly like, again, there's a muscular raw nature to all of this that sounds immediate and dense, and it's never like a wall of sound. You feel every part of the instrumentation. All of it is like exactly where it should be. All of these mixes are just they're so like, again, put on some nice headphones or put this on vinyl and you will like, if you're an audiophile, I don't know how you can't be absolutely gobsmacked by this shit.
I think in particular, like the part about 2.5 minutes into penultimate track, Serenity Painted Death, where it's just it does the pinch harmonic with the guitar squeal. It's like that's a ready to bed you death.
That's I'm So glad you mentioned that. Serenity Painted Death is my favorite song on here. And it's not just because of the way Michael's accent informs the way he pronounces Serenity Painted Death. He says death with more A than anyone I've ever heard pronounce the word death. And it's
and like a
fucking
and like
awesome.
a Y.
And that
There's a
fucking
Y in there somehow.
death. And it sounds like this is the heaviest song this band have made up until this point, and it is vicious. And then White Cluster comes in and actually gives it a run for its money. So
yeah,
and I won't skip over this just because it's my second favorite song on the album, but I think the most emblematic song of this album, maybe this phase of their career, is Face of Melinda, which is by far the song on here I've listened to the most. I think it's the best written track. I think it's the most dynamic track. Like, it is plaintive and beautiful and soft in that front part of it, and then it just like there's no like compositional like ornamentalism that right there is elsewhere on the album. It just decides to be like, no, we're this now, and you're just like, woo.
You're like, thank you, sir. May I have another?
And it manages to imbue you with that sense of like grief and mourning, and it really, like, that atmosphere that was so potent on My Arms Your Hearse feels both thicker and more sharp. You feel it on a deeper level, but you also just kind of immerse yourself in it.
Yeah, I think it's more immersive and pointed, and
totally
just more the cloud hangs heavier, so to speak, which is impressive considering My Arms Your Hearse.
Yeah, like I mean, the only like thing I personally have left to add is that this album held me at a distance for a little while when I first got into the band, just because it was, again, you know, the more I wasn't as familiar with this avenue of music as I would become later on in my music listening tenure. But the thing about this album is that it's perfect basically to the point of alienation on some level. Like, it's perfect in the way that like Dream Theater albums are perfect, and that it's just like, again, you have to be like some flavor of musician or have to have some kind of experience in the world of music to fully appreciate the depth of what they're doing here, which sounds kind of pretentious. I'm aware of that, but like, there is simply a level on which this becomes completely unrelatable to somebody who like doesn't really know their shit when it comes to death metal. And like, that could happen with you. My sincerest sentiment with this record is I recommend it, and to some people I would even recommend it as a starting point. But if this doesn't fully take your breath away the first time you hear it, maybe listen to a couple other Opeth albums. Find the one you really fall in love with. Come back to this one, because personally, for me, I don't, again, this is just the level of Opeth fanboy that I am, that like, I don't know how I like another heavy death metal inclined Opeth album more than this one. That said, I would be aghast if I called it anything other than flawless. This is the totem, in my opinion, of their career. This is the thing that you will compare everything else in this genre to, the thing I compare it to. I like a couple albums in their discography a little bit more, and when I say a couple, I mean two. And this album is just, it is stone cold perfect. It is one of the most perfect things I've ever listened to.
Yeah, perfect to the point of alienation that's about right. I mentioned Kind of Blue in comparison earlier. When truthfully, I think this is much more accurate to like listening to like Bitches Brew after having heard like 3 other jazz albums.
Yep.
Yeah, which if to sell exactly what you did essentially, and why it took you as long to appreciate it as you did. It's just like this is the deep end, and you know, probably start not there. Like, just in general.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have basically filleted this album to the point to which it deserves to be filleted. Frankly, I'm not going to apologize for praising this thing, because That's what I'm here to do, man. Fuck you.
Yeah, well, if you came here to hear dissenting opinions on Opeth's still life, no, you didn't.
Sorry. And Morgan said we're on a bit of a streak album wise, and I hate to break it to you, but that's not going to end anytime soon. And yeah, needless to say, Still Life, a very successful outing for the band. It got them even more notice than My Arms, Your Hearse. This is like, if that album was very critically lauded, this from the get-go was like revelatory for people at the time. Like, people like All Music were tripping over themselves to give this thing good reviews, talk about how great it was. But then that was 1999. So following some of the few live dates that they did in Europe, Opeth returned to the Studio Fredman, to begin work on their next album. And in between this amount of time, they had met Steven Wilson, Porcupine Tree frontman, spearhead of basically every progressive rock album ever's remaster from 2010 onwards. You know him, we know him, we're a big fan. Porcupine Tree is like one of the 5 bands in all of existence I can say I even like more than Opeth. So in many respects, this is a dream scenario for all involved, really. And funnily enough, Morgan and I got into Porcupine Tree and Opeth around the same time without knowing that these two musicians were involved with each other in the slightest. But Morgan's and my beginning of Opeth and of Steven Wilson, the first thing I heard from either of them was, in fact, Blackwater Park. And Steven Wilson produced after gelling very well with Michael Ackerfeld, who in several interviews has cited Porcupine Tree as his favorite band. So taste. The band sought to recreate the recording experience of Still Life and again entered the studio with minimal rehearsals and no lyrics written. This time was tough, Ackerfeld said. I feel pleasantly blown away by the immense result, though. It was indeed worth the effort. Wilson also pushed the band to expand its sound, incorporating new sounds and production techniques. Steve guides us into the realms of strange noises for guitars and voice, Ackerfeld said. Then Opeth released the album on the 21st of February, and in support of Blackwater Park, they embarked on their first world tour, headlined in Europe for the first time, and made an appearance in 2001 at a festival in Germany, playing to a crowd of 60,000. And look, we have covered Blackwater Park on this show before. Last year, when we sort of near the end of the year, it was a recommended record. I believe it was Morgan's. And we talked about it then, and we did an exceptional job of breaking that album down. So I don't think we're going to linger on this record as long as something like Still Life, even though both of us believe that it is every bit as good as something like Still Life. At the very least, it is comparable. But that said, I want to sort of rein in and focus and sort of contextualize and, still do a little bit of bloviating on this album because, I mean, look, my enthusiasm is never ending. And for this is like, I said the more was life-changing, and it was. This whole album, though, quite literally altered the trajectory of my music listening experience as a human being. This was my introduction to death metal. It was my introduction to progressive death metal, into the world of music that I considered to be the thing I hold dearest to me. So yeah, Blackwater Park's a big album for me, but I think it's interesting that Mikhail points out how strange and different Steven pushed their sound to even be. And in that respect, I think a song that perfectly embodies Blackwater Park as a whole and perfectly embodies this new direction that they were going in and the risks that they were taking on being my favorite song on the album, which is The Drapery Falls. And I know, like, that nod Morgan just gave there is just like, internally it's just like, I know why he fucking loves that song. It's fucking because of that guitar tone. The guitar tone on this song is the greatest guitar tone of all fucking time. It is enormous sounding. Like, I can't convey to you, like, this isn't like a monster. This isn't Godzilla smashing Tokyo. This is Lovecraft. this isn't the kind of heavy that like crushes you. This is the kind of heavy that sounds like it's swallowing the mix of the song. And Steven's very intricate mix on this record is essential because as busy as Still Life was, Blackwater Park is just as busy, if not busier. But you can feel out every part of it. But the wash of sound that the guitar tone on this is, and that is slightly lost in translation on some of the live recordings of this song, even though there's a really cool version of it on, I think, Sorceress that incorporates brass into it, which is really interesting. Still prefer the studio recording overall, but the sound of that guitar is sort of the logical progression of what they go from on Moonlapse Vertigo, where I talked about that weird, stranger noises that they would sort of play around with, and that here they capitalize on it. And it's just the best fucking sound. And, it's not a standout on this track for being like, it's not like separate. Every track on here has things like that about it. And like, again, this is Blackwater Park is Blackwater Park. For as much as Still Life is the highest rated Opeth album, this is the most rated Opeth album. Even though it is 0.01 lower rated on Rate Your Music, that's Still Life's a 3.95, this is 3.94. This has 15,000 ratings as opposed to Still Life's 10,000, which if they had just as many, I think that Blackwater Park would come out ahead. It has by far the most amount of ratings as well. And yeah, I mean, this is a moment, this is the fucking master of puppets of progressive death metal. This is the album. Morgan, like what the fuck?
I don't have an answer to that question. Just like this album, when we sucked off the production and engineering of Still Life to no end last segment. So when I tell you that this album I think sounds better, it sounds like God. This is what God sounds like. It is holy. This album is so good that I was seriously upset with Tyler for him giving it a 9.5 and not a 10. In that moment,
you lied to me. You liar.
I was legitimately upset in that moment because he sprang it on me. Part of it was the surprise, and part of it was the fact, like, you coward. Like,
I can't help but share the sentiment. Sorry, Tyler.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here.
Yeah, like, again, if we're being purposefully brief, it's because that episode is one of our better record club reviews, in my opinion. I think we put it, as well as, like, August put very well. He broke down the sort of track by track nature, that this is not a continuous flowing narrative like the previous two albums, but elaborations upon a consistent theme of that kind of rot that Opeth are obsessed with. This is a very dark, kind of ugly, nasty album thematically. It talks about, lovers being unfaithful and then killing one another, and like and sickliness, like on the leper affinity, which Jesus, like, again, like, what a life-changing opening track. I heard this song. I remember exactly where I was. Like many albums from this period, I was working in a drugstore at this time, and Morgan said to me, hey, I think this is my favorite metal album of all time right now. And I was like, fucking, I gotta listen to this. And I turned it on in the middle of that store, and my life was different after that. Like, I just kind of stood there at the cash register and was like, oh my God. It's one of the most dynamic songs this band has ever made. And that's consistent throughout the whole thing. Like, I think my like least favorite song on here is maybe like, I was going to say The Funeral Portrait, but no, that's not my least favorite song. I don't think I have one. I don't like anything here even incrementally less than anything else. I mean, like, I simply like, and the title track. The title track is like maybe the most impressive thing they've made up until this point. Not my favorite, but the single most emblematic of how far this band has come, even though they started off in an incredibly accomplished place. Playing the title track on Blackwater Park after you play something like fucking In the Mist She Was Standing, like
It's just like somebody, I think it was a letterbox review. It was either that or a tweet, but somebody, and it was a review for Spider-Man No Way Home, and it said if you show this to a Victorian child, it would kill them. Um, which is, I said, yeah, that's true.
Father, what
but
kind of music will we be playing today?
But I feel like you show the title track of Blackwater Park to the guy who just heard In the Mist She Was Standing, and it will kill him.
Mm-hmm. That's
Like,
that's 100% true.
were it not for the fact that I had several albums between that experience and this experience,
Killed you.
I start leaking out of my ears.
I mean, to paraphrase one Sir Paul McCartney, it's great, it's good, it's the bloody Opeth's Blackwater Park. Shut up. I mean,
yeah,
like to call this anything other than a monument to everything the band had done and a blueprint for everything they would do, to say it's anything less than that is underselling it, and honestly, like elaborating upon that feels almost dishonest to the totality of the experience. This is like, even if you're not interested in this band or heavy music, which I mean, if you're listening to an Opeth podcast, I don't really know why, but I mean, the internet's a weird place.
Yeah.
You do you. But if you have to prioritize one of these albums, if like I had to say you need to hear an Opeth album before you die, it's this one. You gotta. I don't care if you've never listened to anything but modal jazz and pop your entire life. You must hear this album. You have to sit down and give it the attention that it deserves. And honestly, if you want a more in-depth review, we literally have that. And just repeat everything we fucking said about Still Life and then add, except it's produced by Steven Wilson.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, to say that I think that this, hyperbole thrown about, blah, 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 that personally speaking, if I had to evaluate the achievements that this band accomplishes, that I think what they do next is minimum measurable, maximum better. I mean it. And on that note, after Blackwater Park, which I mean, again, popular, critical success, smash hit, they Opeth won. Opeth went back to Sweden after their world tour, and they began writing the next album. And at first, Ackerfeld had trouble putting together new material. He said, I wanted to write something heavier than we'd ever done. Still, I had all these great mellow parts and arrangements, which I didn't want to go to waste. And then Jonas Rensky of metal band Catatonia, a longtime friend of Mikael Ackerfeld, suggested writing music for two separate albums, one heavy and one soft. Ackerfeld was excited at this prospect and agreed without consulting his bandmates or the record label. Oops! While his bandmates did like the idea of recording two separate albums, Ackerfeld had to convince the label, and I quote, I had to lie somewhat, saying that we had to do this recording very soon. It won't cost more than a regular single album. And with most of the material already written, the band rehearsed just once before entering Nacksving Studios in 2002, and again with producer Steven Wilson in Studio Fredman. Under pressure to complete both albums simultaneously, Ackerfeld said recording the two records was the toughest test of our entire history. After recording the basic tracks, the band moved production to England to first mix the heavy album, Deliverance, with Andy Sneap at Backstage Studios. Deliverance was so poorly recorded without any organization whatsoever, Ackerfeld claimed, and says that Sneap basically is the credited savior of the album and much of its recording. Deliverance was released on the 4th of November in 2002, debuting at number 19 at the US Top Independent Albums chart, marking the band's first chart appearance. And they performed a concert in Stockholm, returned to the UK to finish recording the second of the two albums, Damnation, at Stephen Wilson's recording studio No Man's Land. And although Mikael believed the band could finish both albums, Opeth still managed to complete Deliverance and Damnation in just 7 total weeks of studio time, which was the same amount as Blackwater Park alone. Damnation was released in April 2003 and garnered the band its first appearance on the US Billboard Top 200 at number 192. The album won a Swedish Grammy, and on the 1st of January 2016, Opeth released a remixed version of the album in a double album in one package, done, of course, by Stephen Wilson. Yeah, that brings us to Deliverance and Damnation, which in many respects are about as beloved, I think, by the Opeth fan base as something like Blackwater Park. And it's really difficult to talk about these albums just in like a singularity, because obviously they're both, they're 2 different records and they're 2 different experiences. As I've gotten older, though, these albums, but I appreciate this more as a whole thing now, as a double album. Which I still think it's possible to appreciate these on their own. Make no mistake. I think that's 100% worthwhile. But as a combined effort, this is my personal favorite thing that the band ever did. If you combine these 2 albums together, I think this is the achievement of Opeth as a whole. It is them exercising the dynamic contrast of their sound to its most maximal differences and to the most refined effect of each one. I think that basically everything about these albums works as well as it possibly could. And I think they're perfect to the point of, Alienation undersells these. I would say it's perfect to the point of like absolute refusal to acknowledge the fact that this distilled experience is one of the greatest things of all time. That you shut up. No, yes, it is. I'm gonna fight you. I don't even really know where to even begin, but I guess we can start off by talking about Deliverance as a whole. It's the first one that was released, and it is the most in line with everything that came before it. But I know you have a particular fondness for Deliverance that, of the albums in this run, I'd say that the most taken for granted album amongst them is probably Deliverance. And that's a damn fucking shame. And so tell me why it's a damn fucking shame.
Well, I can start with the fact that they play the title track of this album pretty much every show they do.
Title track of this is just
fuck. Let's see how it's nearly 14 minutes, and when the band said when Michael Ackerfeld said that he wanted to make the heaviest stuff the band had done up to that point, he did not come to play.
How do you go up from inventing a new standard?
I don't, just like distilling it and like running it through the most direct horse blinders level of fucking we are going to kill you.
You need a we are going to beat you to death meme with Opeth. I mean, and by the way, if you haven't seen this, there is basically a in real-time development documentary of the band making these albums available to watch on YouTube. And like, it's amazing to watch. And if you're interested, it's a great watch. But like, it's incredible to witness all of this happen because it's so unassuming. These guys who are these virtuosic, incredible maestros of their respective instruments, and they're just guys. Like they're just hanging out, making music.
Yeah.
You
Like
know?
this is just what they do.
Yeah, they're just
Like, oh,
really
we just
passionate.
yeah, it's just like, yeah, we're just chilling, and then we're gonna lay down some fucking, you know, Mozart level shit.
I mean, like, look, Opeth could do anything Mozart did. Could Mozart do a fair judgment? I think the fuck not.
If Mozart heard a fair judgment, it would kill him.
I think if I heard fair judgment like right now, if I was at the right level of drunk, it would kill me, and I'd welcome
Yeah,
it.
it's just I'd be like, yeah, okay,
And you know what? I'd be
if
fine
this
with
is
it,
the
frankly.
way,
You know?
if this is the way I have to go, then. But yeah,
So
speaking
so
of
be it.
which, that is my favorite song on this album, and maybe just this duology of albums,
Mm.
even. The fuck? But the fact that the title track on Deliverance is not my favorite on that album, just by itself, is like, what are you talking about?
Not to
It's
mention,
just
I mean, like Deliverance. Yeah, this is one of the best tracks the band ever made. This is top 5 Opeth songs, which I mean, if you've listened to anything we've said up until this point, that's a big statement to make. But it opens with fucking Wreath.
oh god, it's
Fuck.
so
Wreath is just a
those
complete declaration of purpose, and you're just like, oh, okay.
fucking filth. It is disgusting
I
in
mean,
the best
this
way.
album sounds like Blackwater Park has this whole like atmospheric kind of thing that Still Life kind of does too, and like the albums can pulverize you, but this album sounds like being incinerated.
Yeah, I like talk about evocative album covers. There is
Mm.
no color to picture when listening to this album other than fucking pitch black. Like it's like covered in oil. It's that black.
Sludge.
How like how much more black could this be? The answer is none.
None.
None more black.
It can't be.
Even in its softer, more atmospheric moments, like a fair judgment, it is still just like if the atmosphere on Still Life weighed even heavier than that on that of My Arms Your Hearse, the atmosphere on that song in particular is like I think of that part in the Looney Tunes cartoon Duck Amuck where Daffy literally has to hold up the black surroundings over him, and it
Yeah.
and it like it is crushing him. That's what it feels like listening to this album, and it's like harder daddy.
Yeah. I fucking like I think that like obviously I mentioned like of the singular Opeth releases, Damnation is my favorite, and I slightly prefer it to this, and I think that like the one dimensionality of these two records, which supremely sells them short. These are not one dimensional albums, but they're clearly single minded in their pursuits. But the single minded pursuit on this album, I feel, is just like, and again, this is only because I'm like refining this down to the most stark of comparisons, is I feel this is slightly more detrimental to this album than it is Damnation, which leads me to not give this the perfect score. But once you put it together with Damnation and it feels more holistic, it manages to sort of obfuscate that problem for me, which is barely even a problem because it really doesn't impact my enjoyment at all. It's just my critical brain being my critical brain. But one thing I want to note about this is the different productions on the original studio release and the remasters. And I don't know if it's what your opinion is on this specifically, but in my opinion, at least, like, I don't know if it had to do with the fact that the recording for this was so tumultuous or it was so rushed and it had to be saved. But distinctly, this is a more unfriendly recording than the last two albums by a considerable degree. Frankly, it's really
Mhm.
claustrophobic, and I say that like, Still Life, perfect to the point of alienation. Like, no, this is a creative choice that is distinctly different, and it very well could all hold you at arm's length. This is like the, the drumming on this, which as a whole, the drumming on Deliverance and Damnation both is maybe the single greatest achievement by anyone not named Gene Hoglan in the world of progressive metal drumming. Like, Martin Lopez is going like I don't know what this man had to do, what fucking genie he found, what fucking monkey's paw deal he had to make, whose soul he had to sell it to, but this man is accomplishing wonders, and the sound of the drums on this record in particular is blistering, titanic, blah 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 blah. Like, it sounds like an explosion is happening in your ear. Like, it almost hurts, and you're just kind of like,
Yeah.
you're like, more, do it more. I like it. Like,
The
there's
fucking
some masochism to this album that, like, it invokes the title of Deliverance and Damnation. Like, there's not like a narrative journey on these two albums, but there is an emotional one where you're sort of like, you're experiencing the tortured hellfire of a damned soul on this one, and on the next one you're seeing the more contemplative internal emotional journey, and it really doesn't relent on here, and the drums are a big part of why.
yeah, I think part of where I come down on the remix situation is just the fact that I heard the originals first,
Me too.
and I don't want anything different from those,
Yeah,
frankly.
kind of.
Really, I do think the remix version of Deliverance in particular kind of it does make the album more accessible, I think, but it also kind of neuters a little bit of the purpose,
Yes, I agree completely.
um, which is to just to, we are going to beat your ass, and anything less than that sort of compromises what this album really means, at least to me, which is even in its softest moments, just weighing on you like somebody has their foot on your skull.
It's
And
awesome.
it's, oh God, yeah. I think the Damnation mix on that version is pretty, you know, I mean, it's great.
Yeah, I think that, like, it goes to show you how mixing, like, as an art form kind of works, and that, like, it's remixed, it's updated, and like, it's clear you can hear it, like, there's a little bit more clarity. That said, the atmosphere is slightly diminished. If that's something that holds you at arm's length about this album, though, go check out the new version, because that might
Yeah.
be the version you end up preferring. If, like, you just want it to sound more like Blackwater Park, congratulations, that's the version of it that sounds more like Blackwater Park. And it's not like a complete difference. It's not like a, one to one, like, oh my god, this is so different. Like, it's mostly the same. I wouldn't rate the albums differently, but there is a difference, and you notice it. And I agree. I think the Damnation remix is like, any differences in that mix are basically negligible in my opinion, which is why I think it's good. In that, like, it's different.
Yeah.
I don't really have a preference as to which one I think does it better, because, like, I listened to the original and I'm like, no, this is, I mean, bleh. But, like, to segue into Damnation, which is my favorite singular release from the band. Oh boy, talk about a pivot. This is completely devoid of death metal, completely. Like, there's
Mhm.
just that said, this album tends to get, I won't say undersold. It's a beloved record, but that said, to say this is like devoid of metal is just to say that it's like, oh, somebody listened to Window Pane and In My Time of Need and then not the rest of the record. Like, there are points on shit like Closure and Hope Leaves where it gets, I mean, like, it's metal, like, it's progressive metal. There's no mistaking that. And oh man, this is the album that got me into this band. This is another great accessible release from the band that, again, if you're less familiar with heavy music and you need like an great place to start here, because it's just as good as anything else like that. But it's also like, it's deeply emotional and deeply atmospheric in the same way that those records are. It's taking their approach to death metal and just using it vis-a-vis progressive rock. And it's honestly some of the most thematically and lyrically compelling stuff that they've ever made. This is like, to say this is dour undersells it. Like, this is I would describe this record as suicidal. I have listened to this
Yeah.
album while feeling depressed endless amounts of times, just because it is perfect music to that. It is beautifully arranged. I mean, stuff like Window Pane and In My Time of Need are dynamic and beautiful and interesting, but Opeth does not sacrifice anything by abandoning their death metal roots here. They are exploring a facet of their sound that's always been there, and they're fleshing it out about as well as it could ever be done. It's 43 minutes long, which is, I think, the perfect length for something like this. It doesn't outstay its welcome, but it's not like brief to the point of feeling insubstantial. The journey it takes you on feels complete, and the emotions that it takes you through, the wandering soul, like it's like you're wandering through purgatory, and it's just so fucking like it's just like, I don't even know how to describe it. There's no record that embodies the sound of suicidal ideation quite like this does for me, which makes it a very personal record in a way that some of Opeth's music can't quite hope to strive for, frankly. Not to undersell them, that's not what they're trying to do, but this is something that feels like it comes from a real place, like, something that maybe somebody had experienced at some point, and it's so musically accomplished. Like, again, just because the death metal is gone, Lopez's drumming on this is ridiculous. It is
No,
stupid.
I mean, it's like, oh, instead of creating one of the best progressive death metal albums of all time, we are simply going to create one of the best progressive albums of all time. So fuck you. Um, yeah.
Getting Stephen
In
Wilson to produce
terms,
it, pretty good idea.
yeah, turned out all right. Um, I think in the biggest point of comparison for this record that I think I've always had, um, particularly when you put it in the framework of what suicidal ideation sounds like. The only thing I can really compare it to is Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack for Silent Hill 2.
Oh yeah,
It's
100%.
like the instrumental tonalities are different a lot of the time. And Silent Hill 2 is more diverse. It's obviously longer and portrays it is a soundtrack, so it portrays more uh, musical ideas than Damnation, but it feels the same to me of
Mm-hmm.
just being at of both feeling like you were at the bottom of the emotional graph, like this is
Yeah.
the lowest point of the valley, but also like you're in a sort of floating limbo
Mm-hmm.
of I mean, it feels like capturing the place between life and death that depression can so often feel like. It's like I'm not dead, but I'm not living either.
Yeah, that's kind of like stasis. You're just kind of
Yeah.
in between, and you just don't know how to. Like, it's like the Deliverance album cover. It's that album cover too. I think is similarly evocative. You just kind of look at it, and it's just like if there's like this lifeless doll, and it's got that same hazy black white contrast thing going on, and it's just like I've just listened to single songs from this so much, and just like it's by far my most listened to Opeth album, which if that tells you anything about my emotional state, whoa. Um, but
Well,
like
hey,
it allowed me an into this band that, like, again, this isn't to downplay anything else that they've done, but like this is an emotional earnest record that really feels relatable, that really feels like it's definitely drenched in that kind of gothic atmosphere that is found on other Opeth songs like this, but it is channeled into it's channeled with purpose that serves more than just the narrative or purely just the music. This is one of the most densely atmospheric records I've ever heard. And the pure combination of all these instruments to make this specific sound is something that I don't really think another band has been able to accomplish in such a way. Like, I think maybe the closest is probably something like Porcupine Tree's Deadwing. I would say that that's maybe the most analogous record to this, and even then, that's a much harsher, heavier, angrier album. And this is way, way more about just kind of sitting in it and just kind of waiting in it. And I think it's perfect as a singular experience. But when you combine it with Deliverance, the contrast, again, that's what this band's all about. It's emphasizing contrast. And when you put them together, it becomes an experience that's like so elevated and beyond anything that they've done. It's a totemic fucking achievement. And songs like Window Pane, Death Whispered a Lullaby, Closure, To Rid the Disease, and the deeply, deeply underrated closing track, Weakness, deserve to be lauded with the band's best work, in my opinion. And they aren't really just because this is an album is kind of taken as a whole by most people, and rather for its isolated moments, which I do kind of understand. But this is a different kind of Opeth record. But yeah, that is Deliverance and Damnation. And if maybe, you know, try the new mixes if it doesn't gel with you completely, but still definitely something that's worthwhile. And yeah, so the band, you know, they're kind of at the peak of their popularity at this point, and they embark on their biggest tour yet. They played 200 shows in 2003 and 2004, which is insane. They performed 3 special shows in Europe with 2 song lists each, 1 acoustic, 1 heavy. They recorded their first DVD, which is Lamentations, live at Shepherd's Bush Empire. That's the live album. And it was in London, England.
Say stellar recording.
I think I would say that's my favorite of the live albums.
Yeah, I think most, if not all of it, was of the DVD is available on YouTube now.
Yes.
Definitely worth checking out.
100% worth your time. Like, totally. If you like these albums or just them in general, go seek it out. Yeah, it's a 2-hour performance. It's the entire Damnation album, several songs from Deliverance, Blackwater Park, and a 1-hour documentary that I mentioned. After this, something very, very unfortunate stuff happened to Opeth. They were scheduled to perform in Jordan without a crew due to the fear of terrorist attacks in the Middle East. They distributed 6,000 tickets for the concert before the band left for Jordan, but drummer Martin Lopez called Ackerfeld saying that he was having an anxiety attack and could not perform, forcing the band to cancel the show. And in early 2004, Lopez was sent home from Canada after more anxiety attacks on tour. And Opeth decided against canceling the remainder of the tour, with Lopez's drum technician filling in for 2 concerts. Lopez promised that he would return to the tour as soon as he possibly could, but 2 shows later, Opeth asked, wait for it, strapping young lad drummer Gene Hoglan to fill in. Lopez returned to Opeth for the Seattle show on the final leg for the tour, and Per Weiberg also joined the band on tour to perform for the keyboards after more than a year on tour. But this is sort of the inciting incident for what would cause Lopez eventually to exit the band, which is unfortunate just because he is a essential part of what makes all of these fucking albums as great as they are, even though his replacement is in and of himself a great drummer. But now, the next phase properly. They returned home in 2004. They wrote material for their 8th album, and by the end of the year, they finished writing it. Opeth's European label, Music for Nations, closed its doors in 2005. They had to negotiate with various labels, and eventually they signed with Roadrunner Records. Ackerfeld said the primary reason they wanted to sign with them was because of the wide distribution. They wanted it to be available at larger chain retailers. Height of their popularity, obviously, as to why they would want to do that. When news leaked that the band was signed to Roadrunner, who predominantly worked with trend-oriented rock and metal, they were a really popular label at the time, some fans accused the band of selling out. And on this, Ackerfeld said, to be honest, that's such an insult after 15 years as a band and 8 records. I can't believe I haven't earned each and every Opeth fan's credibility after all these years. I mean, our songs are 10 minutes long, for fuck's sake, which Yes, King.
Yeah.
Go off. Absolutely.
It's like, Opeth sold out.
And not to like jump the gun or anything, but imagine
You
saying that Opeth sold out on when they were about to make Ghost Reveries. Sure,
you
Jan.
you those who said this,
Fool.
you sir or madam or fucking them, I don't know. You're
Yeah,
an idiot.
fuck
Doesn't
you.
just stupid. Yeah, you're gonna stick with this band for 15 years and 8 albums. Be like, oh, I signed the same record label that Slipknot's on. I don't like them no more.
Right after they make fucking Deliverance. Who are
Man,
you? So the band rehearsed for 3 weeks before they entered the studio. The first time the band had properly rehearsed since My Arms Your Hearse, which, wow. During rehearsal, keyboardist Weiberg joined Opeth as a full-time member, as I mentioned. They recorded in Fascination Street Studios and released Ghost Reveries on the 30th of August to critical acclaim and commercial success. The album debuted at number 64 in the US and number 9 in Sweden, higher than any previous Opeth release. So that brings us to Ghost Reveries, which is certainly a fan favorite album. It's not quite considered at the highs of Still Life in Blackwater Park, but then again, no metal album made by this band or otherwise is, because it can't be. It's literally impossible.
yeah.
But that said, this is an album that sort of is definitely beloved a lot by fans. And well, see, the thing about that is that if you discount me counting Deliverance Damnation as one thing, as my favorite Opeth thing, this is my personal favorite Opeth heavy album release, as me owning the vinyl here might imply. And I think that's for a couple of notable reasons, in that this is like, of all of the Opeth records made thus far, I think this is, at least structurally, it's a little bit more similar to earlier records. Like it's kind of like if you took the first two by way of My Arms Your Hearse, and then it's longer and has a more fleshed out track list, but it has these like huge, enormous centerpiece 10-minute, 15-minute tracks that are just like, totems to this band. And Steven Wilson didn't produce this album. That said, I think the production work is no less impressive than anything that's happened thus far. I think that basically it's like the still life sound. But what's notable about the difference of sound here is the sort of incorporation of, this is where Opeth becomes like more far reaching in terms of their influences. There's influence of shit like world music on some of the guitar tones on here. This is something that's distinctly a bit more unwieldy and progressive than even anything they've made before. It's so ambitious, and it's consistently ambitious. And like, I won't lie, it definitely took an adjustment period for me to get over the sort of hurdle of the fact that, structurally speaking, I think this is a good, like, this is a well-structured album for doing what it's doing. And it is my favorite of this kind of album, just because the songs, love them so much. But again, structurally, this is unwieldy as fuck. In terms of comparisons, this is Opeth's the Bedlam and Goliath, not just in terms of the fact that it's influenced by world music, but in the sense that this is the most Opeth album. I mean, it fucking kicks off with Ghost of Perdition, which, by the way, is my favorite Opeth opener. And I mean, just I can't undersell how each part of this song, which it's so dynamic, it has like 8 distinct movements in it, and it's like 10 minutes long. But that iconic fucking opening of the doom, 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 like really gloomy, you're just like, oh, I wonder what this is going to be. And then immediately you get fucking Demon of the Fall mode, Mikhail just being like, Ghost of Mother. And you're just like, whoa, how does this band find ways to get heavier? And as a result, this album becomes like, it is no less accomplished than anything they've made. It is as technically excellent as anything they could do, but it is a journey that took me years to really properly appreciate, like with the Bedlam and Goliath, and that it kicks off with Ghost of Perdition and the Baying of the Hounds, which are two 10-minute long songs. And they did like Orchid and Morningrise, which that wasn't a stranger to albums like that. The thing is that Morningrise was fucking 5 tracks long, and Ghost Reveries here is 8. And that leads to, it's just like 10-minute song, 10-minute song, 8-minute song, 5-minute song, 1-minute song, 11-minute song, 5-minute song, 10-minute song, 2-minute song. And it's like, wait a minute, this is a lot. This is a lot to go back and forth from. And especially because these songs in and of themselves are so dynamic. They keep changing. Like this album is restless, like to the point of, like, if Still Life was a perfect crystallized embodiment of Opeth as a band, as a sound, to the point of alienation, then this is ambitious to the point of alienation. And I totally get why it wouldn't be somebody's favorite, or if they just think it's really, really great, or like, it's a masterpiece, but it's their lesser masterpiece. I get it. But that said, the single quality of the songs themselves, coupled with the fact that coming off of Deliverance and Damnation, they had sort of honed their atmospheric potency and their emotional tonality to be at its sharpest. And that leads these distinct songs to having really, really specific feelings and moods that feel so colorful. And this is like an anthology. Each of these songs is a very specific story that details, a character, a struggle, a journey. And they're so good at evoking what they're trying to do here. And I just love all of it. I mean, the Baying of the Hounds contains maybe my favorite guitar riff of all fucking time. It's just so stupidly fucking hard.
Fucking filth. Just absolute filth.
I mean, like, it's full of momentum and verve, and Mikhail is switching it up so frequently on this record, and I am just so enamored with it. The older I get and the more into progressive music I get, the more I appreciate the ability to capitalize on ambition, because there's so many bands that just kind of like, they keep trying to shoot for the stars and eventually they just kind of lose their magic. And the great thing about Opeth is, despite what we might say about some other records later on down the line, is that I don't really think they lose their magic, so to speak. Is that the reason that Ghost Reveries is such a marvelous record, despite the fact that I think it's unwieldy, is that unwieldiness works to its benefit, in my opinion. Is this is always exciting, even after, like, this is my most listened to heavy Opeth album, and it has only gotten better in my eyes. But I know that you, of all people, are not going to come in with a dissenting opinion, but as someone who speaks more for the positives of this album and how it can be taken as like, oh, this can be your favorite Opeth album, there are definitely certain aspects of the record that I think even I would be willing to admit are not exactly going to work with everybody. And I think you can probably speak to that a little bit more than I can.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, of the 7 record run from My Arms, Your Hearse to Watershed,
The greatest record run of all time.
Yes. This is my least favorite of them.
Mm-hmm.
And which is stupid.
Yeah. I mean, like, what?
Yeah, it's like a 9.5 out of 10.
Yeah. I mean, like, what the fuck?
Yeah. And I think part of that relative disconnect, because the only way that this record suffers is in comparison to the 6 other masterpieces that they dropped in this time frame.
Yes.
Is the fact that it is such everything in the kitchen sink level of what this band has been doing and what they would do later, that every now and then you're probably bound to not quite click with something. Like, this is even shown on the fact that on the 2 song, or the Reverie / Harlequin Forest, I'm not all that crazy about Reverie, and I adore Harlequin Forest.
God mode Opeth, honestly.
Yeah. but the fact that that dichotomy is there just in those two songs that are put together in one song, I think really goes to show a lot of what I'm talking about here.
And certain versions of the album have them separated, and certain versions of them have them combined. So like I personally
Yeah,
listen to the version that has them combined, and I think that makes the flow a lot easier to digest. So, if you go out and seek this album, maybe do that.
yeah, but I would probably say that while that does make the album more cohesive, I think as a single flowing unit,
Mhm.
I appreciate that there is a version that I can find that is just
Just,
Harlequin
yeah,
Forest.
that's understandable.
Um, and as everything after that, Hours of Wealth and Isolation Years in particular is fantastic. And I think the Grand Conjuration is fantastic in its own right, but it is just a little bit too long in my opinion.
It's
Um,
also like the fourth 10-minute long song on this album.
yeah,
So,
again, this album is capital letters trademark a lot.
yeah.
Um,
Like I think I love the Grand Conjuration. I have that at a 5 out of 5 on Rate Your Music, and I still can't deny that it does suffer from the fact that again, you had to go through like 40 minutes of album to get there.
yeah. I will say I love just how much a keyboard is given focus here in
Yes.
comparison
Yes.
to this album run, particularly the use of organ sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Big part of Opeth
that
sound from now on.
yeah, and that is never done better than on here in pretty much all of this album, except maybe one track in particular on Watershed, where that is given a
Mm.
particular focus, and I'm like, Jesus. Um,
God.
yeah. But I think Hours of Wealth and Beneath the Mire, which is my favorite song on this album,
Fuck
uh,
yeah. Love Beneath the Mire.
like just like the first minute of that song, if you're not like God, then I don't care to know you.
I mean, like this, in my opinion, is the most fun Opeth album. Like it's got a verve to it, that I just that makes listening to it like the atmosphere of it is effective in parts and like somber in like some really potent moments. But like this is the album that I'm just like, yeah, yeah, the most with.
Yeah, I feel like this is the one that the band had the most fun recording, or at least it
Yeah.
sounds that way. Um, and like their approach at this point is less like let's tell a cohesive story with this magnum opus of an album like they had been doing for the last several. And on this one, it's just like let's just do the sickest shit we can think of.
Uh-huh.
And I think that really is well communicated and conveyed on here.
Totally.
And yeah,
Like it's again, this is a mileage may vary album, but like there is nothing about this album save for the fact that of its unwieldiness that is any less excellent than anything before it. So it could be a grower, it could alienate you a little bit, but that's the thing is that this is just such a colorful, amazing, great time of an album. And also, I just gotta say, Isolation Years is a fucking hell of a closer. One of their most
yeah,
underrated songs. Like that's again one of those really emotionally potent moments. Like Hours of Wealth in that song are just fucking fantastic. And you just kind of feel like, oh, I feel I was having fun, but now I kind of want to die a little
yeah.
bit.
That's good. Maybe maybe it do be like that sometimes.
Yeah, it just like evokes this image of this guy watching life go by in like the middle of this house, or like a haunted spirit who's like haunting this place and just witnessing life happen even though he's departed. And you're just like, damn, these motherfuckers are good storytellers. How the fuck did that happen?
Yeah,
But yeah,
crazy.
that's the immense monumental insanity that is Ghost Reveries, and I love it very, very dearly. After Ghost Reveries, though, on May 12th, 2006, Lopez officially announced that he parted ways with Opeth due to his health problems and was replaced with mainstay until this year, drummer Martin Axelrod. Opeth toured on the main stage of Gigantor in 2006 alongside Megadeth. Ghost Reveries was re-released in 2006 with a bonus cover song, Deep Purple Soldier of Fortune, which is better than the original song, Fight Me. A DVD featuring a 5.1 surround mix of the album, which I have listened to and is terrific, and a documentary on making of the record, which I have not seen. In 2006, their live album was released, The Shepherd's Bush Empire, we mentioned that already. In 2007, Peter Lindgren announced that he would be leaving Opeth after 16 years. The decision has been the toughest I've ever made, but it is the right one to make at this point in my life, he said. I feel that I have simply lost some of the enthusiasm and inspiration needed to participate in a band that has grown from a few guys playing the music we love to a worldwide industry. So, I mean, coming after Ghost Reveries, that is not surprising at all. So, ex-arch enemy guitarist Fredrik Åkesson replaced Lindgren. As Åkerfeldt explained, Fredrik was the only name that popped up thinking about a replacement for Peter. In my opinion, he's one of the top 3 guitar players out of Sweden. We all get along nice, and we've known each other for maybe 4 years, and he already had experience to take on the circus-like lifestyle as we lead the members of Opeth. And 2008, we have sort of 2 releases here, but the first is the minor one, which is the EP Burden. It is the only EP Opeth have released that is not a radio sampler, so effectively it is the only Opeth EP properly, and it is 3 songs. It is the radio edit of the song Burden, which appears on Watershed, the song Mellotron Heart, and a cover of Alice in Chains' Wood. And personally speaking, I think the EP is very good. It's 3 songs, so it's pretty easy to cover, but the standout here to me is, in fact, the cover of Wood. And I mean, it's Opeth covering Wood. It's great. Period. There's nothing to elaborate here. That it's like it sounds like an Opeth song instead of an Alice in Chains song, and it's Mikael Åkerfeldt on vocals. And I think Burden is a great song, but the radio edit is it's trimmed down, but it's good. It's Burden. It's a great song. I'll talk about it when we talk about the actual proper song.
Yeah, I find the idea of a radio edit of that song sacrilegious.
I mean,
but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's good, but I'm never going to pick it over the normal version. And admittedly, I don't really like Mellotron Heart that much. I don't think it's a bad song. It's just I don't like the sound of it that much. I think the tonality of the keyboard on this is a little weird, and it just kind of overly relies on that for the duration of the song. And it's but it it's worth listening to. Obviously, go check it out if you haven't. But then we get, of course, the big boy, Watershed. It is their 9th studio album, with Åkerfeldt producing, notably. And Opeth had recorded 13 songs, including 3 cover songs. The finished album, Watershed, features 7 core tracks, with cover songs used as bonus tracks on different versions of the album. You can find all 3 bonus tracks on several versions of the record now, on streaming, blah, blah, blah. Watershed was released in June 2008, and Åkerfeldt describes it as being a bit more energetic, in his own words. Opeth toured in support of Watershed, including headlining the UK Defenders of the Faith tour with Arch Enemy, an appearance at Wacken Open Air, and the Progressive Nation tour with headliner Dream Theater. So they're touring some big fucking names. It was their highest charting album to date, debuting at number 23. And generally speaking, it's a very successful record. That said, if Deliverance is sort of an album I think gets the most under discussed, I think Watershed here is probably a close second for the most taken for granted in this particular run. And I've always thought this album was great. That said, revisiting it in the past year or so, especially last year, my affinity for this album grew a lot. And listening to it for this and those core 7 tracks, this is the perfect follow-up to Ghost Reveries. This is them as tight as they were on Still Life, but as instrumentally varied and nuts as they were on Ghost Reveries, but with a little bit more of an anchor and a more solid foundation. And look, I'm not saying that this is this is set in stone or anything or like whatever, because picking favorite songs from this band is literally like picking children. This is Sophie's choice here, and I'm not as good of an actress as Meryl Streep. But I think Heir Apparent is my favorite Opeth song. This album, the heaviness of this record cannot be understated. And this song is brutal. Like, this song sounds like fucking deathcore. This is ridiculous. And it's as dynamic and interesting as anything on the album that came before it. It is brutal. You start out with Coil, which is a very, very pretty, very good song that, it's the gentle Opeth song, and it leads directly into this with that just beginning, that fiery fucking when you're just like, oh shit, oh shit, they still got it.
The nastiest chord that anyone ever put to wax.
It's fucking filthy. And yeah, shock of all shocks, greatest album run of all time ends on a not even slightly underwhelming or disappointing note. I never gave this album the credit that it deserved, frankly, but these 7 songs are as tight, as beautiful, as heavy as anything they'd ever make. And in many respects, I think this is like, Watershed is an appropriate title because it combines that earlier succinct tightness and that later adventurousness into a perfect package that feels like it's a highlight reel of this entire era. And as a result, it's like, hey, it's a highlight reel of a highlight reel. I mean,
yeah.
And also the keyboard playing that you mentioned from the last album comes back and is even more present on here, more consistently, and I would argue even better. The playing and soloing of every instrument is great, but the keyboard especially, you're almost just like, damn, she got bars.
Yeah, particularly on something like Burden, where the keyboard solo on that that's in between verses is like
stupid.
Okay. Okay. And speaking of that song, I feel like I have to have 2 number 1 favorite Opeth songs. One that's really heavy, and the other that is more,
fair enough.
It has clean vocals, and it is more of a sort of rock song instead of a really heavy death metal track.
Yeah,
and Burden is tied with the more for my number 1 Opeth song.
Yep.
And I think in particular, I want to note that that Burden has my favorite guitar solo, full stop.
It's so good, man. It's so good, man.
Oh. Like, it's just fucking, it's just weeping as, like, I think it is Ackerfeld and Axon just trading off licks during
jazzy.
Yeah,
ridiculous.
And the final, the part before the final passage that it ends off on, which is the slowly detuning acoustic guitar.
Oh my god, I love that part so much.
Oh my god.
It feels like the track is eating itself. It sounds insane. It's like nothing they've ever done before.
And then the very end of it is like the fucking Sweet Leaf beginning, where it's just some guy going.
You're just like,
what? Who thought of this? Why are you doing this to me? But the part of the solo that's in between the just pure riffing and the detuned acoustic guitars, where it's like, I'm like, what's the vibes? I feel a lot right now. And it's just because you're noodling on this 6-string, sir. Fuck you.
The fact that they keep finding new ways to exercise this idea this far into their career. like, we can say a lot of this broadly similar things about each of these albums, but the amazing thing is how each of them really does feel like they have their own identity. Because if one of them was too similar to the other, it would be diminished severely. But it's just not. This is so
Yeah.
its own beast.
Yeah. This record in particular, I think of like we compared Ghost Reveries to Bedlam and Goliath and the Mars Volta's discography, and to compare it to another 2000s act, I think of Watershed as Opeth's Saturday Night Wrist, um,
Mm.
where it's sort of in between two really definitive statements for the band, for better or worse, depending on which band you're talking about. Um,
Transitional, but all of it benefits from all of the ways it's transitional.
exactly. Um, and it serves as this really, you know, watershed moment for both of the bands. Uh, and sort of as a result almost goes unsung
Mm-hmm.
because of that, but then has at that point just sort of completely turned around and people singing its praises to make up for the relative lack of
Yeah.
praise singing that it had, to where it is like pretty much just at the exact level of hype that it deserves. I adore this record. It's not one of the, 5 10s that I have for this band, but again, 9.5, 9
Yeah,
level
same.
type of stuff. Um, and it serves oddly enough as a really sort of poignant, I almost think of it as a poignant farewell to this band, considering the next 10 years of their career.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
completely agree with the sentiment, frankly. I love Watershed as much as I love any favorite album from one of my favorite bands, frankly. And the fact that it's not like upper echelon Opeth for me, like I look at it and I want to say it's my favorite. Like
yeah,
it's ridiculous. I feel infuriated that I can't say this is like top three or whatever. The only like distinct weakness I really have with this album is, well, first of all, I have to say it's a tentative statement, I suppose, but like with one notable exception, this is like the most consistent Opeth album to me, in that, with the exception of its bookends, I think this is straight tens. That said, I think that Coil is a good introduction, but I really have to say it really works for me as a combo for like it itself is a good song, but you have to combine it with Heir Apparent for it to be a great song. And
yeah,
comparatively speaking, like again, it's Heir Apparent, Lotus Ear, Burden, Porcelain Heart, Hessian Peel, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. Hex Omega is like a 9. It's a great song.
yeah.
It's a great closer. I just don't love it quite as much as I love the other songs. And but like again, to call this a weakness is just like, I mean, like whatever, man. I don't fucking I love listening to this album. It has a lot of the same appeal as Ghost Reveries does in that respect. I could see myself eventually like tenning this. I don't know, but it's
Yeah,
as good of a way to end an era of a band as you can, and that's all there is to it.
yeah, yeah. I think the best way I can put it is like when you get the rare person that says that Watershed is their favorite Opeth album. Uh, it to my reaction is like I do not agree at all, but that is the most based pick.
Yeah, it's just like you're a cool motherfucker, and I like you
Yeah,
because I know you've listened to
yeah,
this band enough to say that, and that's dope. Um,
yeah.
and okay, look, we've been singing praises for a while now. You might be worried. It's just like, is this one little mode that they're in? Is this all they got? First of all, no. Actually,
And
listen to what we
Jesus,
have to say.
I wish it was for one thing.
Yeah, and look, here's the thing: is that we're gonna do this a little bit differently than people have done sections in the past. In that we've sort of signaled the fact that this is sort of the end of an era for the band, and it is. Basically, Watershed is to date the last album to incorporate any kind of a death metal influence on Opeth's sound. The 4 albums that follow it, that go from 2011's Heritage to 2019's In Cauda Venenum, is they focus more on the progressive rock and progressive metal aspects of their sound. And look, here's the thing, is that on the one hand, I completely sympathize with Opeth fans that really, really love this era of the band. And there are. I went out of my way to go on the Opeth subreddit and pose a question to everyone about this, because we signal the fact this is not our favorite era of the band. And quite honestly, it's an era I am very frustrated with, that I've gone back and forth on my select opinions on, but have still ultimately come down as being more negative than positive. But the thing is that my opinion and Morgan's opinion, because we're about on the same wavelength with each of these, more or less. But that opinion is so consensus that it's boring. Like this is what every typical music fan, or even what every Opeth fan thinks. And on the subreddit, I frequently pay attention to is the fact that there's a lot to appreciate about these new albums. And for starters, I think that Morgan and I have dug deeply enough into this band and have listened to these albums in particular enough times to have a little bit more of a nuanced opinion other than new Opeth bad. But we still have, like, we've honed in what it is we like and don't like about them. And the reason we're combining this era into one thing is because if you were worried that we might start repeating ourselves in the positive parts, we're really going to start repeating ourselves here, is because a lot of these albums are similar in sound or what they're doing or how they're produced, and frankly it would just not make for an entertaining segment. So I at least did some research and tried to ask newer Opeth fans who were either, you know, fans of only this era of the band or fans of all of the band, what they really liked about it. And I won't lie, it was definitely illuminating. I wanted to make this as robust of a segment as humanly possible. And in sort of that sense, what we have here is we have to set the precedent for, well, if they abandoned progressive death metal, then what did they do? And my best answer to that succinctly is that they became, well, my best succinct answer is also my most pithy answer, which is both a little mean-spirited but also kind of true, is that they became a King Crimson tribute band. Which is, it, again, I love King Crimson. I love all eras of King Crimson. That said, Mikhail clearly felt compelled, like he stated multiple times, that this is the artistic direction he wanted to take. And I respect it. This is not Opeth selling out. This is not Opeth taking a downturn in even like even though I think there is a stark difference in terms of my overall enjoyment and in some respects the quality of the albums, this isn't like I don't think anyone tries any less on these albums. Like the work that each individual is putting in on these records is about as good as they've ever done. I don't think they suddenly stopped being good. That said, they are pursuing a sound and a direction that I think has caused a rift in the fan base. And it's obvious because you take a look at these albums on Rate Your Music, you know. So I think I wanted to explore exactly what it is that has caused the aforementioned rift that we were talking about and the change up in sound, because it is very distinct and very different. It's a lot more core to a throwback 70s, early 80s progressive rock sound. Again, stuff like King Crimson, stuff like Yes, it has a lot of influence here. You could feel sort of stuff that's really like keyboard heavy that was kind of showing up on stuff like Ghost Reveries and Watershed. So it's a logical progression, if nothing else. But we start off with 2011's Heritage. It was 3 years after Watershed, and this is, like, typically speaking, I think considered the weakest. It's the lowest rated on Rate Your Music, and generally speaking, it's like the least talked about Opeth album. And fucking Steven Wilson notably is a co-producer of this. He's not the sole producer. And yeah,
it's either this or Sorceress.
Yeah,
for the least well regarded.
I gotta say, the broadest issue I have with Heritage and with these 3 albums, in Cauda Venenum, not excluded. I'll say we have a separate section for that to cover on its own. It's just these three albums. But broadly speaking, I am so frustrated with the production on these albums. So
Yeah.
so frustrated, and it really rears its head on Pale Communion above the others, which is my personal least favorite. um like, which is funny because it wasn't always the case. Like, I think it has some of the best core songs. Like, if you hear them performed live, a lot of them are pretty decent.
Yeah.
That said, oh man, I hate the way the fucking keyboards are mixed onto these fucking records, man. Oh,
It's so
it's
like
so ugly.
it's so weirdly bad because like if you would think that there were two people who could produce an album like this and fucking nail it, it would be Steven Wilson and Michael Ackerfeld. So all that you're left there with all that you're left with there is to it's like, oh, they made a conscious decision to make this sound kind of shitty.
Yeah, and like, again, to sort of, to I guess counterpoint that as best as I can, is that like there is definitely, if nothing else, a marked difference from how these albums are produced. There is a difference. That said, I think the sort of general prevailing trend of people who like these albums, people like Pale Communion or Heritage and whatnot, they like how basically what I can compare the production style to is actually something like Bitches Brew, where everything in the mix feels very textural. It's not about sort of isolating elements, it's about combining them together and making a specific atmosphere. And that's what people tend to enjoy about these, is that they enjoy the atmosphere, the sort of jazziness of everything, and the how it all comes together. And that's where I think most people tend to disagree, is that with me, is that I think the instrumentals, the playing, the soloing is all as good as Opeth have ever done, but it's just goes to show you how vital song construction is, because especially on stuff like Heritage and Pale Communion specifically, and about half of Sorceress, the way these instrumentals are put together sounds so cacophonous and gray sometimes. Like, it doesn't feel like they're happening in the same song. It feels like they're just kind of put together haphazardly. And it's so frustrating to listen to. And it's like the mix is more atmospheric, it's a bit more all encompassing. But for some people, me and Morgan included, it sounds gray. It sounds kind of sludgy. It's so much more
It's
difficult to enjoy.
it really does feel more so much more monotonous than anything that they did before.
Yeah, the sound and direction is just inherently a little bit less dynamic. And again, like, I do genuinely think the keyboard mixing on some of these is pretty bad. It
Yeah.
sounds garish. But that is to say, I'm not like a uniform hater of this, and that I think each of these albums has highlights. I think Sorceress is like, I definitely don't think this is the best of the three albums. I think the best is probably Heritage, but Sorceress has the most highlights for me, even though it's probably the most mixed bag they've got. Really, it's that second half of the album that I have a lot of fondness for, at least, like, relatively. I think Willow the Wisp is a
Yeah.
beautiful song. Just a fucking fantastic song. And I think actually the run of Will-O-Wisp, Chrysalis, and Sorceress 2 is pretty fucking good, actually. Like, it focuses on the elements of the band that feel like they're happening with a little bit more synergy. Whereas it feels like a lot of what these albums are focused on is the individuals playing are like, they're soloing, they're doing a good job, they're doing like a really like something very instrumentally accomplished, but it doesn't always feel to me like it's happening in a communicative way. What makes Bitches Brew such an achievement is it feels like there's communication between the players, and the communication just doesn't feel as strong here to me. It feels like everyone is trying very hard and doing a good job, but the uniformity's just not here. Especially on, like, there are moments on stuff like Strange Brew or A Fleeting Glance, which like are captivating, and then everything that happens in between these captivating moments feels like noise.
Yeah. It's I Sorceress is my least favorite Opeth album.
Yeah,
Um
that's understandable.
just because it is such a mixed bag inherently. And while it might be more sort of exciting on a moment by moment basis, just because it's more diverse than
Yeah.
Heritage and Pale Communion, um, it's just, you know, they stray further from the bullseye more frequently than they do on Heritage and Pale Communion because of that,
Oh yeah.
and it makes for easily the most frustrating listen of them.
Sorceress
Um,
is the ghost reveries of the new era of Opeth in many ways, which is why I enjoy it
yeah,
more and why you enjoy it less.
yeah, that's probably about right. Of these three, I would say Heritage is my favorite.
Yeah, I agree.
And I do want to shout out some moments on it that I
Please.
like quite a bit. Um, I'll shout out I Feel the Dark, Slither, and
Mm-hmm.
Famine as really
Famine.
solid
Yeah.
moments. Yeah. Even if they don't sound as good as they should
Yeah.
for a variety of reasons. Um, so I think that album is mediocre, but it's
Yeah. Agree.
also like the most agreeable to me of these three.
Oh yeah. There's nothing that's
And the one
like
and
assaultive about the mixes on here that I find really egregious about something like Pale Communion.
yeah, um, Pale Communion is like, yeah, I don't know, try as I might, I find it difficult to. I've listened to this album several times. I swear I have, and I
Me
swear
too.
it is so difficult to remember anything about it.
The opener is it's rough. I can't it's a trial of patience for me, honestly. It's a very like I get what it's going for, I do, but it comes across as so uniformly ugly sounding.
I mean, it sounds like somebody took the fucking 2-bit soundtrack to like a really early Castlevania and
Yeah.
then made it uglier than the 2-bit sound
Like a
itself.
bad remaster of Symphony of the Night
Yeah, it's like
soundtrack.
yeah, it's like you added more and made it worse.
Fucking tinny synths.
Uh-huh.
They are unfortunately here on stuff like Cusp of Eternity and Goblin and
Mm.
River. It's oh man, it's so difficult to even remember what some of these sound like. And again, Pale Communion is sort of the epitome of like every individual part is pretty good, and then you throw it all together and it sounds like a big sludgy mess. There's like
Yeah.
I think Moon Above, Sun Below is like a comparative high point, and I still have so many issues about how that sounds. Like I can't quite call the album good.
No. No.
It's frustrating because I
Uh,
tried. I really did with these three.
mhm. Yeah, I remember when I first heard it, I almost hated Heritage and
Yeah,
disliked
funny.
it the most. And now it's easily my favorite of these three.
It's because it's the most
Um,
abrupt change, I think.
and that really shook everything up in terms of my perspective. And now that I have some time and distance away from that, I can
Yeah,
appreciate what Heritage is doing more, even if I don't appreciate it a
yeah.
lot. Um, Sorceress is just like it's the most diverse album of this era, and yet somehow to me sounds the most uninspired. And
Yeah,
that is not good at all.
it's such a strange beast too, because like of the production on these three albums, while I do think it's universally similar and has universally similar problems, I think Sorceress is the best produced. It's just that messiness of the lack of uniformity here being at its most chaotic and most like, and maybe that's what people appreciate about it. I get that. And there's definitely a lot of the appreciation too that I read from is a lot of the lyrical performance or the lyrical work here, and the singing. And yes, that is definitely something that like Mikael's singing is as good as it's ever been. It's very like, I'm not one person who's going to be like, oh, he doesn't growl anymore so it's bad. No, his singing voice is great. um I will say these albums lose something in the dynamism of the older albums, because it's not because growling gone. It's just that when you have albums that are very uniform and sound like this, that are a little bit less diverse than what's come before it, the longer run times are just really hurt. Like, it's just that a lot of these things are inconveniences that are difficult to trip over. Like, these performances are good, but they're the same kind of good. And that admittedly leads me to having a bit of a distance. Like, I don't as get along with the lyrics as well, just because I don't get past the music. Like, I don't really know what a lot of these songs or what these albums are about thematically, just because it doesn't resonate with me because I can't get past the music. And because, like, it's like what you said earlier on the podcast this year. I can't remember about what album, but it's just like there's no album that, like, you know, its thematic and lyrical content can be great, but if the music's not good, what use of it is it to me? Like, I just,
Yeah, I mean, it's just if I wanted to be engaged by just words, I'd go read a poetry book. I don't know, man.
like, yeah,
I
if the
hate to be
music
that.
works for you, I get it, but like, that's why it can't for us. It just can't.
Yeah,
So, like, there's good things about these albums, and like, I can't in good conscience tell you to ignore them, but I also can't in good conscience recommend any of them.
yeah. It's solely like person by person, whether or not you will dig these three at all.
That's the thing, is that, like, to understand Opeth's narrative, you only really even need to hear one of these three albums to understand what they're doing, because again, it's broadly very, very similar, very progressive, very, like, and again, the thing is also is that what they're doing is a little bit less unique and a little bit less, like, singular than their death metal stuff. Is that a lot of this is like, I would just go listen to something like Discipline or Lizard by King Crimson to get this kind of
Yeah.
flavor, and it's
Or
better produced.
I don't know, the Raven that refused to sing.
Steven Wilson.
Yeah.
So again, it's like, this isn't a case of Opeth albums bad. This is just a case of, it's difficult. It's hard.
Yeah.
I sympathize with you immensely. And for this final segment here, I don't just sympathize, I empathize, because we're going to talk about their most recent album, In Cauda Venenum. Venenum, excuse me, it's Latin. Notably, this album has two distinct versions, an English and a Swedish version. I haven't looked too deeply into the differences, but as far as I can tell, it's basically just the lyrics. Um,
Yeah.
the only real notable thing about them is, like, the lines themselves and the delivery of some of the hooks sound a little bit less like, again, it's really not like they're the same, but the laboredness of the Swedish version is a little bit like, it feels like these were designed in Swedish first and then English afterwards. I
Right.
slightly prefer listening to the Swedish version, but there's really not a difference. But for me, anyway, this was an album that I lumped in with the previous three records as being a part of this era of the band, and it is, distinctly, it is part of this era of the band. That said, when I went back and revisited this, I listened to it. That's what I failed to do before, is that I listened to this when it came out. I just knew it as a new Opeth album. I wasn't listening to other Opeth records to be able to hone my opinion, to be able to really understand this album. I just kind of listened to it and I was like, this is good. This is better than the previous three albums. I enjoy this front to back, but it's not really, like, again, it doesn't quite have the magic, and I just forgot about it. And then I revisited it, and I will say, I think this is not only better than the other three records, I think it's considerably better. Do I think this is as good as anything in the golden run of Opeth? No, not quite. I think that some of its best moments might shine up with some of their other best moments. But I will put it to you like this. If the albums they were making were as good as this, in my opinion, then they never would have fallen off, in at least by, like, public perception. I think that basically what comes together on this album is the uniformity, the chaos, the sort of the atmospheric focus of those previous three records, and the fact that the instruments felt like they were happening, completely irrespective of each other. That element is gone on this album, in my opinion. every one of these songs feels focused. Every one of them feels communicative. It feels like the synergy that they had on previous records. And that has so much mileage with these albums. It goes to show you how the differences of these particular aspects can get along and not get along. And I think that's represented by the fact that this does have considerably better reception than the previous three. And when I listened to it again and I really gave this album my all, I enjoyed all of it. Like every song here, I think is more or less just a really great progressive rock or progressive metal song. There's a distinct eeriness here that I feel like is trying to be channeled into something like Pale Communion or Sorceress. That again, the mixing just really holds me back from truly feeling. But here, it feels real. I really love songs like again, the standouts here. Songs like Garden of Earthly Delights is a decent intro. It's good in the same way that I think the first song on something like Watershed is good. But the follow up to it, fucking Dignity, is a rager. My God, this album
Yeah,
also just
I feel
has
like
so much more energy than the other albums do.
Dignity is like so immediately to me. It sounds so much more inspired than anything the band had been doing for the
Oh yeah,
last for this particular era, and it feels like they're more excited to be doing what they're doing than they have in a long time. And that, like you said, that goes a long way in terms of my appreciation of not just the song but the album in general, because I have that feeling about everything on here.
yeah, totally. I think that like, yeah, there's not like a song on here that like really I like less than the others. I will say I want to point out one thing that just really struck me when I was re-listening to it. The song Universal Truth. Um, this song has a melody on it that stopped me dead in my tracks because it is like plagiarism levels of similar to You Know My Name by Chris Cornell. Like hand to God, go listen to those two songs and just be like, oh, because there's like the part where the arm yourself because no one else here will save you. That part is like it's in the fucking song. And like again,
Uh-huh.
this isn't a bad thing. It's really good. The song's really good. Um, but there are just parts of it that I was just really struck by, and I kind of like loved that about it because I was able to identify like a singularity here that really like caused me to have an affinity for it. And there are songs like the Garroter on here which thematically do have like kind of a contemporary relevance to it. This feels like not a political album, but an album that's focused on tearing down people who are in positions of power, sort of the corruption and what have you. And that feels thematically very resonant. I feel like something like that's something that Opeth have never lost a step in, but the music here allows me to actually enjoy it. Something as hard as like I don't know why I never really fucked with Heart and Hand, the lead single to this, as much as I do, but it's a fucking banger. I really like that
Yeah.
song now. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's the vocal harmonies on across this album, they're spectacular. I mean this with like every word, bone in my body. They're in some respects they're better than they ever have been. The way that they're using like there's like gang vocals on this, which there never really have been. They're so good whenever they pop up. They're like a huge highlight of this album for me that really lend it that distinct identity on stuff like Charlatan, Heart and Hand, Next of Kin. Um, I'll say if I have any weaknesses with this album that holds it back from me saying that it's as good as anything else, because again, the soloing, the performances, the production, it's as good as this band ever have been. I mean that with all of who I am. I will say I think that the second half doesn't feel as immediate to me as the first half does. Is that I think a lot of it is great. I don't think any of it is bad or even mediocre, but the immediacy of it does feel a little bit less on songs like Continuum and the closer All Things Will Pass, even though All Things Were Past second half song is a great fucking closer. But generally speaking, I am so glad that I used your all's informed perspectives to come back and really appreciate this album because, again, it's not as good as the Opeth Golden Run. I do think that, but it's considerably higher. Like it's an album I legitimately enjoy listening to and will like go back to and have fun with. I think it's a properly great album that just, again, when you're a band that has done nothing but crank out masterpieces, when you make something that's anything less than that, and I mean anything less than that, it's going to be seen as lesser. And this album deserves a better rep. I like really do think that. But I don't know, generally speaking. I know we were both kind of mild on it when it came out. How is it to you now?
Yeah, it's easily the Opeth album I've spent the least time with,
Ditto.
even though of the past four, it is the one I enjoy the most by far.
Oh yes,
Um,
the gap is
I can
wide.
like, yeah, I can plainly say that this is a good album, where the previous three are just not, whether or not they are bad or just mediocre. Um, and I do think it is unfortunate how little time I've spent with it. And that's my fault. Um, I think I also just approached a point around when this album came out of just kind of burnout
Yeah, me too.
with this band, where I did prepare a little bit for this episode, but I
Mhm.
didn't have to at
No,
all.
I mean,
Um, I just knew
we're
it.
the Opeth guys.
I am familiar with the material. Um,
We
but
understand
this
the
was the one
assignment.
yeah, this is the one that I spent the most time with in that bit of preparation. Um, and there's tons that I appreciate about this record, um, but I still feel like I need more time with it to sort of, I don't know, adapt to it, I
Mhm.
guess. Um, yeah, so it feels like I'm definitely still on the journey with this record, so to speak.
And honestly, I think that even with Opeth's best albums, is that there's still a journey with it. Is that upon like this is a dense band. And while I loved so many of these albums upon first listening, I didn't love them nearly as much as I love them now. And yeah, that's just discovering a favorite band. That's what it's like. But there is sort of a gestation period that you need to kind of accept with this band. And, in this less essential era of the band, I think that's probably what causes people to slightly dismiss this, even though if its reception's generally better. But that said, I think in the coming, after this, I'm way more willing to go back to it. That has some great highlights. I want to spend more time with. That's the best thing about it. I want to listen to it more. I think it's great. But going forward, Opeth still like they're touring right now. They're touring with Mastodon, which wish we weren't in a global pandemic. It's fine. I'm not upset about that. But the since this album came out, that tour is sort of the most notable thing to happen to them, save for the fact that very, very, very recently, Martin Axelrod was ousted from the band. We do not know, we do not have an official reason why, but like, this is not the first time that's happened with Opeth. There's been personal reasons. It has been speculated that there is maybe a thing to have to do with vaccinations, but there's nothing definitive about it. So gotta emphasize that.
Yeah.
But Axelrod is not in the band anymore, which is a shame. He is a great drummer. He has done great
Hmm.
work on great albums. But I have faith that the band can, because that's the thing, is that as long as Mikael is spearheading it, I will keep listening to this band. I will give anything they make a shot, whether or not it sounds like Pale Communion, Heritage, or like whatever they make, I will listen to just because they have earned that from me. But
Yeah.
in Cauda Venenum being the step up that it is does genuinely make me excited to see what this band could do from here on out, because I know that they're going beyond being that more sedentary, more derivative sound that, while has its fans, doesn't excite me in the ways that I love this band for. But they are still capable of doing that. So I'm excited to see what the band does next, even though there isn't any formal announcement for new music. But the thing is that since like God, early on in the career of like basically fucking Blackwater Park, it's been pretty consistent. Is that every 2 or 3 years we get a new Opeth album, and frankly, it's been fucking 2019. It was the release of In Cauda Venenum, so it's about to be 2022, which will be the longest gap in between Opeth albums since fucking the first couple ones. And yeah, there's a global pandemic, so it's reasonable to expect that if they do want to make a new album, it probably won't come here until 2023. That said, I think there is reason to be excited for what Opeth have to do next. And yeah, that's the discography of Opeth so far. And I
Yo.
guess to close it out, we should do our rankings and ratings. And I look, here's the thing: we typically do favorite songs from this band, but it's impossible. It's
Yeah, I
impossible.
don't have that prepared.
Like it would take me an extra week to parse through what my top 10 Opeth songs would be, and it would I would have to spend so much more time on it, and I just don't have that kind of time on my hands.
Okay, so at the very bottom at 13, we have Sorceress. I'd give that a 4.5 out of 10,
Mm.
somewhere in there. And then Pale Communion at 12, which I would give a 4.5 or a 5. Um, then 11 is Heritage, which I would give a 5. Um, at 10, we have In Cauda Venenum, which right now I would give a tentative 6.5.
Hmm.
But that's liable to go up. At number 9, I have Orchid, which I would give an 8. At 8, I have Morningrise, which I would give an 8 as well. 7, I have Ghost Reveries, which I would give a 9 to a 9.5. 6, I have Watershed, which I'd give a 9.5. At 5 is Deliverance, which is a 10. At 4 is My Arms Your Hearse, which is a 10. At 3 is Blackwater Park, which is a 10. And number 2 is Damnation, which is a 10. And number 1 is Still Life, which is an 11. I mean, a 10. Yeah.
I mean, fucking give it an 11, man. Fuck everybody.
Yeah.
I don't give a fuck.
Listening
Finalized
to
here
Opeth on your telephone,
on your
get real.
fucking headphones. My ranking is I'm putting Damnation and Deliverance as one project because that's how I view it now, and you can't fucking tell me otherwise because fuck you, fight me. So in
Yeah.
12th place, I have Pale Communion, which is a 4 out of 10. In 11th place, I have Sorceress, which is like a 4.5 out of 10. 10, I have Heritage, which is a 5 out of 10. 9, I have Orchid, which is a 6.5 out of 10. 8, I have Morningrise, which is a 7 out of 10. 7, I have In Cauda Venenum, which is a light 8 out of 10. 6, My Arms Your Hearse, 9.5 out of 10. Big leap. 5, Watershed, 9.5 out of 10. 4, Blackwater Park, 10 out of 10. 3, Still Life, 10 out of 10. 2, Ghost Reveries, 10 out of 10. And number 1, Damnation Deliverance, project as a whole, 10 out of 10. And that's it. That's the fucking Opeth video. We fucking did it. God damn.
Show's over.
Show's
Go
over.
home.
Go home. And yeah, look forward to our new content in the new year. It's been lovely hanging with you. Go listen to fucking Blackwater Park or something. I don't fucking know.
Yeah.
Just fucking rock over London, rock on Chicago, fucking Sprite, eat fresh. What the fuck is there?
I don't
Fucking
know. I don't know, but that's it now.
fucking drink piss.